Clara Whitmore lifted her chin and stepped down from the stagecoach into a wall of laughter. Every eye in Red Willow fixed on her body, and not one of them looked away. Ethan Walker stood frozen at the sight of the bride he had sent for, too ashamed to step forward, too proud to turn back. He had married her to save his ranch. He never imagined she would be the one to save him. Before we go any further, hit that subscribe button so you never miss a moment of this story, and drop a comment below telling us what city you're watching from tonight. I read every single one, and I want to know how far this story has traveled. The stagecoach rolled into Red Willow at noon, kicking up a trail of dust that settled over the boardwalk like a warning nobody heeded. Clara Whitmore heard the laughter before she even saw the faces attached to it. She had expected stares. She had prepared herself for whispers behind gloved hands. What she had not prepared for was the sound of a grown man slapping his knee and howling like he'd just watched a mule dance a jig. "Lord have mercy," the man wheezed, doubling over outside the mercantile. "Walker sent for a wife and got himself a whole herd." Clara's fingers tightened around the handle of her single suitcase. She did not look at him. She looked instead at the driver who would not meet her eyes as he set her trunk down in the dirt harder than necessary. "This the last stop for Red Willow?" she asked him, her voice steady, even though her stomach had folded itself into a knot somewhere around Cheyenne. "Yes, ma'am." The driver tipped his hat quick and businesslike, already turning away. "Reckon someone's supposed to be meeting you." Someone was. Clara scanned the street, the mercantile with its barrels of flour stacked outside the saloon, with its doors hanging crooked on their hinges, the little white church at the end of the road, with its bell tower leaning slightly to the left, like even the building was tired of holding itself up. And then she saw him. He stood apart from the crowd that had gathered the way a man stands when he already knows he is about to be the subject of conversation for the next 6 months. Tall, broad through the shoulders in the way men got from years of real work, not vanity. A gray hat pulled low enough to shade eyes that Clara could tell even from 30 feet away were fixed on her with something closer to dread than welcome. He did not laugh. That was the only thing in his favor. Clara squared her shoulders and walked toward him, her boots sending up small puffs of dust, with each step the whispers trailing her like a second shadow. "Would that be a whole cow he's about to marry?" A woman's voice carried from the porch of the general store, not even bothering to lower itself. "Bet the preacher'll need 2 chairs just to marry him standing up," a man added, and the laughter rose again, ugly and easy, the kind of cruelty that cost the person saying it nothing at all. Clara did not slow her pace. She had learned a long time ago that if she let her feet stop, her courage stopped with them. She stopped in front of the man in the gray hat. Up close, he was younger than she expected, no older than 35, with a jaw that hadn't been shaved in a day or two, and hands that hung at his sides like he didn't know what to do with them. His eyes were blue, the kind of blue that belonged to a man who spent his life staring at distances, not people. "Mr. Walker?" she asked. He didn't answer right away. His gaze moved over her, not the slow, insulting crawl the men behind her had given her, but something quicker, more startled, like a man who has been handed something he did not order and does not know how to send back. "Ethan," he said finally. "Ethan Walker." "Clara Whitmore." She held out her hand, gloved and steady, though her heart was slamming against her ribs hard enough that she wondered if he could see it. "I believe you were expecting me." Somewhere behind her, a child's voice piped up, too young to understand cruelty was supposed to be quiet. "Ma, why's the cowboy marrying someone so big?" The silence that followed was worse than the laughter. Ethan's jaw tightened. Clara watched it tighten, watched the muscle jump once beneath the stubble, and braced herself for him to agree to apologize, to say there had been some mistake, and put her right back on that stagecoach. Instead, he reached out and shook her hand. His grip was firm. Careful, like he was handling something he did not want to break, though whether that carefulness was kindness or simply manners, Clara could not yet tell. "I was expecting you," he said. "Wasn't expecting." He stopped himself. "Wasn't expecting a woman my size." Clara finished for him, because she had rather say it herself than let the whole street keep saying it for her. No, I don't suppose you were. The advertisement didn't ask. Something flickered across his face. Not quite shame. Not quite respect. Something in between, like he hadn't expected her to meet the insult head-on instead of shrinking from it. No, he agreed quietly. It didn't. Well? Clara picked her suitcase back up before he could offer, because she had learned that too, that a woman who reached for her own bags gave people one less thing to pity her for. I reckon we ought to get out of the street before your neighbors run out of things to say about my waistline and start in on my hat. For one brief second, so brief Clara almost missed it, the corner of Ethan Walker's mouth twitched like it wanted to smile and had forgotten how. This way, he said, and reached for her trunk instead, hefting it onto his shoulder like it weighed nothing at all. Wagons around back. They walked past the mercantile, past the saloon, past a cluster of women in starched dresses who did not bother to whisper. Poor Ethan Walker, one of them said, loud enough to be heard clearly. A stout woman with iron-gray curls escaping her bonnet. Drought take his cattle, and now this. The Lord truly does test some men harder than others. Agnes, a second woman murmured, though there was no real reprimand in it, only the pretense of one. I'm only saying what everyone's thinking, Louise. Agnes did not lower her voice at all. That poor man deserves better than a bride the size of a barn door. Clara felt the heat rise up her neck, but she kept walking, kept her chin level, kept her eyes forward. She had cried over words like that once years ago in a town far behind her. She had promised herself she would not do it again in front of strangers who did not deserve the sight of her tears. Beside her, Ethan stopped walking. He turned toward the women, and though he said nothing at first, something in the set of his shoulders made the porch go quiet. Agnes Collier, he said, his voice low and even. You got something to say to my wife, you can say it to me first. Agnes's mouth opened then closed. Now, Ethan, I didn't mean... Reckon you did, he said. Reckon you meant every word of it. He settled his hat lower with 2 fingers, an old habit, a gesture that in Red Willow meant a conversation was finished. Good day, ladies. He turned and kept walking. Clara's trunk still balanced on his shoulder like it weighed nothing, and Clara had to hurry her steps to keep pace with him. Behind them, the porch had gone silent for the first time since the stagecoach pulled in. Clara said nothing until they reached the wagon, a plain thing, with 2 tired horses standing patient in their traces. Ethan set the trunk down in the bed harder than he needed to, and she understood the sound wasn't meant for the trunk at all. You didn't have to do that, she said. Do what? Defend me, in front of everyone. She climbed up onto the wagon seat before he could offer a hand, settling her skirts around her, her suitcase clutched in her lap like a shield. You've only known me the length of one handshake. Ethan climbed up beside her, took the reins in both hands, and for a long moment did not answer. The wagon lurched forward, and Red Willow began to slide past them. The church, the schoolhouse, a scattering of houses that thinned out the farther they went, until there was nothing but open land and the long gray line of mountains in the distance. Didn't do it for you, he said finally. Clara's spine stiffened. I see. Did it 'cause a man who lets his neighbors talk that way about his own wife in the street ain't much of a man at all. He kept his eyes on the road. Whatever this marriage is arrangement business, whatever word you want to put to it, you're wearing my name now. I don't let anybody drag my name through the dirt, not even for a laugh. Clara turned that over in her mind, searching for the insult buried in it, and found to her surprise that there wasn't one. It wasn't tenderness. It wasn't even particularly kind. But it was the first time in longer than she cared to admit that a man had drawn a line between himself and the people mocking her, and stood on her side of it. Well, she said quietly, thank you all the same. He grunted, which she was beginning to understand was the closest thing to you're welcome that he offered. They rode in silence for a while, the wagon wheels creaking over the dry ground, dust rising in slow curls behind them. Clara studied the land as it passed golden cracked in places where the summer had baked it too long without rain cattle scattered thin across pasture that should have been thick with grass. "Drought's bad this year," she said. "Not a question." Ethan's hands tightened slightly on the reins. "Bad enough." "How bad?" He was quiet long enough that Clara thought he might not answer at all. Then, without looking at her, "Bad enough I had to write to a mail-order bride agency instead of courtin' a woman proper like my mother would have wanted. Bad enough the bank's given me till the first snow to make good on what I owe, or they take the ranch out from under me." His jaw worked. "Figured a wife could help hold things together. Cook, keep house. Keep the place from fallin' apart around my ears while I try to save it. That's the whole of it, Miss Whitmore. No use dressin' it up as something finer than what it is." "Clara," she said. He glanced at her brow furrowed. "You may as well call me Clara," she said. "Seeing as I'm to be your wife by supper time, Miss Whitmore seems a formality we can dispense with." Something crossed his face again, not quite amusement, but adjacent to it. "Clara, then. And I appreciate you telling me the truth of it," she added. "I'd rather know exactly what's expected of me than discover it in pieces." "Ain't much expected," he said. "Cook, keep house. Don't need you fond of me, and I ain't got the time to be fond of you, not with everything ridin' on this ranch. It's an arrangement plain and simple. Come the day I've got the debt paid and the ranch secure, if you find you'd rather be elsewhere, I won't hold you to nothin' you don't want held." Clara absorbed that, felt the small private sting of it settle somewhere beneath her ribs, and set it aside. She had not come 200 miles expecting romance. She had come because the alternative, staying where she was, in a town that had made her a joke long before Red Willow ever got the chance, had been worse than the uncertainty of this. "That suits me fine," she said, and was almost surprised by how steady her voice came out. They crested a low rise, and the ranch house came into view below a modest two-story building, its paint faded and peeling in places, a barn standing sturdier than the house itself, fences that had clearly been mended more than once by hands too busy to do the job properly the first time. "It ain't much," Ethan said, and there was something almost defensive in it, like he expected her to say so herself. "It's a home," Clara said simply. "I've lived in worse that called itself finer." He looked at her sideways like he was trying to work out whether that was a kindness or a lie, and could not decide. The wagon rolled to a stop in the yard, and Clara climbed down before he could reach her side, gathering her skirts, taking in the place that was to be hers. However temporarily, however coldly, the arrangement had been laid out. A dog loped out from behind the barn, barking twice before its tail began to wag, and behind it came an old man, gray-whiskered, moving with the careful deliberateness of a body that had worked hard for a great many years. He wiped his hands on his trousers and squinted at Clara with open curiosity, none of the cruelty that had greeted her in town. "This the bride, then?" he asked Ethan. "Clara," Ethan said. "Clara, this is Otis. Been working this land longer than I've been alive near enough. He'll tell you different, but don't believe him, Otis Graham. Don't know a fact from a fine tale." "Now that's plain slander," Otis said, but his eyes crinkled at the corners, and he took off his hat and held it against his chest as he looked at Clara. "Ma'am, pleasure. Mr. Graham." Clara found herself smiling, a real one, the first since the stagecoach had rolled into town. "Thank you for the welcome." "Only welcome you'll get worth havin', probably," Otis said with a glance toward the road that told Clara he'd heard somehow already what kind of reception she'd gotten in town. "Don't mind Red Willow, ma'am. Town's got more mouth than sense always has." "Otis." Ethan said a warning in it, though not an unkind one. "I'm only saying what is true." Otis settled his hat back on his head. "Well, preacher's expectin' you both at 4. Reckon you'll want to get settled first." Clara's stomach dropped. 4 today. Ethan was already unloading her trunk from the wagon bed, not meeting her eyes. "Didn't see the sense in waitin'. Bank don't care whether I'm married a week or a day long, as I'm married before they come callin' about the debt. Faster it's done faster, we can both get on with things. Faster we can both get on with things." Clara turned the words over, feeling their edges, and understood them for what they were, not cruelty exactly, but a man so braced against disappointment that he'd rather rush toward the thing he dreaded than let it linger. "Well then," she said, lifting her chin the way she had in the street, the way she had learned to do 100 times before, in 100 rooms that had not wanted her in them. I suppose I'd best change my dress. The church was smaller up close than it had looked from the road. Its pews half empty, the afternoon light slanting gold and heavy through windows that hadn't been cleaned in some time. Clara stood at the front of it in her second-best dress. The good one had wrinkled too badly in the trunk to wear with her hands folded in front of her, and her heart beating so hard she was certain the preacher could hear it. Word had gotten around. It always did in towns like this. A dozen or so townsfolk had come to watch, not out of goodwill, but out of the same hunger that had filled the street that morning, the hunger to see something they could talk about over supper for the next month. Agnes Collier sat in the third pew, her mouth set in a thin line of disapproval that did nothing to disguise the avid curiosity in her eyes. Beside her sat a man Clara didn't recognize, well dressed in a way that stood out sharply against the dust and denim of everyone else in the room, his coat too fine for a town like Red Willow, his boots too clean. He watched the proceedings with the mild, faintly amused expression of a man observing a card game he had no stake in. "Who is that?" Clara whispered to Otis, who stood near enough to hear her. Otis followed her gaze, and his expression darkened just slightly, just enough that Clara noticed. "Victor Hale," he said low. "Owns most the land east of here, and he's got his eye on the rest of it near as I can tell, including what's under our boots right now. Ranch owner Bank's biggest depositor, and the reason half the little spreads around here have gone under these past 2 years, though he'll smile at you the whole while he's doing it." Otis's voice dropped further. "Don't know why he'd bother coming to a wedding he wasn't invited to. Man like that don't do nothing without a reason." Clara filed that away, the way she filed most things carefully in the part of her mind that had learned over the years that information was armor, and a woman without armor did not last long in rooms that wished her ill. The preacher, a thin, kind-faced man named Thomas, cleared his throat and gestured for Ethan to come stand beside her. Ethan crossed the small space between them, with the stiff, careful walk of a man approaching a task he had already decided to endure rather than enjoy. Up close in the church light, Clara could see faint lines at the corners of his eyes, not from age, but from years of squinting into sun and wind and worry, and something in her chest softened toward him despite herself. "Dearly beloved," Preacher Thomas began, and from the third pew, Agnes Collier made a small sound that might have been a scoff, quickly disguised as a cough. Clara did not look at her. She looked instead at Ethan, who was looking straight ahead at the preacher, with the fixed, distant expression of a man enduring something, rather than experiencing it, and she thought not for the first time that day that she had traded one kind of loneliness for another, and could not yet say which was worse. "Ethan Walker," the preacher said, "do you take this woman?" "I do," Ethan said, before the question had even finished forming quick and clipped like a man ripping off a bandage rather than let it torment him. A ripple of something laughter maybe, or something crueler than laughter moved through the pews. Preacher Thomas's brow furrowed slightly, but he continued, "And Clara Whitmore, do you take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Clara's throat tightened. She thought of the town she'd left, the mother who had wept with relief rather than sorrow to see her go, the years of being looked past, looked over, looked through like she was furniture rather than a woman. She thought of Ethan's voice in the street that morning. "Don't let anybody drag my name through the dirt," not even for a laugh, and found that despite everything, despite the coldness of the arrangement and the strangeness of the day, some small, stubborn part of her wanted this, wanted to belong somewhere, even if that somewhere had not asked to want her back. "I do," she said, and her voice did not shake. "Then by the power vested in me," Preacher Thomas said, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." There was no kiss. Ethan did not reach for her hand. He simply turned, nodded once toward the preacher, and said, "Oblige, Thomas," in the same tone a man might use to thank someone for passing the salt. From the third pew, Victor Hale rose, smoothing the front of his fine coat, and began to clap, slow, deliberate. Each clap landing in the silence, like a small stone dropped into still water. "Well?" He said, his voice carrying easily across the small church, pleasant on the surface, and sharp underneath. the way a knife could be pleasant to look at, right up until it wasn't. "Congratulations, Walker. Didn't think you had it in you to save that ranch of yours, but I suppose a man'll try anything when the bank's knocking." His eyes moved to Clara, slow and assessing, and though his mouth remained politely curved, there was nothing polite in the way he looked at her. "Mrs. Walker, what a surprise you are." Clara held his gaze and did not flinch. She had faced worse than a well-dressed man's condescension. "Mr. Hale," she said evenly, "I don't believe we've been introduced." "No," he agreed, "we haven't. Victor Hale. I own the Hale Cattle Company east of the river." He smiled, and it did not reach his eyes at all. "I do hope you're prepared for ranch life, Mrs. Walker. It's demanding work. Not everyone's built for it." The insult was so smoothly delivered that half the room didn't seem to notice it at all. Only Clara and Ethan, whose hand had come to rest unexpectedly at the small of her back, light but firm, a silent line drawn in the sand. "She's built for plenty," Ethan said, his voice quiet, but carrying an edge Clara hadn't heard from him yet. "More than most folks I know." Hale's smile didn't waver, but something behind his eyes sharpened, filed itself away for later. "I'm sure. Well." He settled his hat onto his head with 2 fingers, an unhurried gesture. "I'll leave you two to your celebration. Do give my regards to First Trust when you see them, Walker. I hear they've got some concerns about that water rights filing of yours. Shame if there were an irregularity." He walked out without waiting for a reply, and the church door swung shut behind him with a soft, final click that seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Clara looked up at Ethan. "Water rights filing." Ethan's jaw was tight, his eyes fixed on the closed door. "Ain't nothin'," he said too quickly. "Ain't nothin' for you to worry over." Clara did not believe him, not entirely, but she recognized the particular stubbornness in his voice, the same stubbornness she'd heard in the street that morning, and understood that pressing him now in front of the last of the departing crowd would earn her nothing but a closed door of his own. "All right," she said quietly. "Not today." The ranch house was quiet by the time they returned, the light gone gold and long across the yard. Otis having already disappeared toward the bunkhouse with the tip of his hat and a murmured, "Evenin', Mrs. Walker," that made something warm flicker briefly in Clara's chest, the first time all day anyone had used that name and meant it kindly. Ethan carried her trunk up the narrow stairs without being asked, setting it down in a small room at the end of the hall, clean, sparse, a bed with a faded quilt, a washstand, a single window looking out over the pasture. "This'll be your room," he said, standing in the doorway like he wasn't sure he was allowed further in than that. "Mine's down the hall. Figured—" He stopped, cleared his throat. "Figured you'd want your own space, given the nature of things." "Given the nature of things," Clara repeated, and something in her voice must have carried more than she intended because Ethan's eyes flicked to her face, searching. "That a problem?" "No," Clara said, and meant it mostly. "No, that suits." He nodded once and turned to go, then paused in the doorway, his hand braced against the frame. For a moment, he looked like he might say something else, something that wasn't about rooms or arrangements or the business of surviving a drought, but whatever it was, he swallowed it back down. "Supper's usually simple," he said instead. "Beans, cornbread, whatever Otis shot that week. I ain't much for cooking, never had the need to learn it proper." "I can cook," Clara said. "I'd like to if it's all the same to you. Give myself something useful to do, seeing as I've come a long way to be of use." Something crossed his face, surprise maybe, or the particular discomfort of a man unused to being offered kindness he hadn't specifically bargained for. "Obliged," he said again and disappeared down the hall, his boots heavy on the old floorboards. Clara stood alone in the small room that was now hers, listening to the sounds of a house she did not yet know. The settle of old wood, the distant lowing of cattle, the wind moving steady and dry against the window glass. She set her suitcase on the bed and opened it slowly, her hands trembling now that there was no one left to see them. She had not cried in the street. She had not cried in the church. Not even when Victor Hale had looked at her like she was a joke he was too polite to finish telling. But alone now in a stranger's house wearing a stranger's name, Clara allowed herself one long, unsteady breath and let a single tear fall before she wiped it away with the back of her glove. "You did not come here to be pitied," she reminded herself, the same words she'd given Ethan Walker on the street that morning. "You came here to build something, even if it's small, even if it's cold, even if it's an arrangement and nothing more." Downstairs, she heard Ethan moving through the kitchen, the scrape of a chair, the clatter of a pot, and beneath the sound of it so quiet, she almost missed it. She thought she heard him let out a long breath of his own, the sound of a man who had also spent the day holding himself together by sheer will alone. Clara closed her suitcase, smoothed her skirts, and went downstairs to make supper in a kitchen that did not yet feel like hers for a husband who had made it clear he expected nothing from her beyond usefulness. She told herself that was enough. She told herself that a great many times over the days that followed mornings spent scrubbing a kitchen that had clearly gone untouched by a woman's hand, in years afternoons spent learning the particular rhythms of a ranch under strain, evenings spent in a silence with Ethan Walker that was neither warm nor entirely cold, but something uncertain and unnamed in between. She noticed things in those first days. She noticed that Ethan rose before dawn and did not stop moving until well past dark, as though exhaustion were a debt he was determined to pay in full alongside the one at the bank. She noticed that he ate whatever she put in front of him without complaint, and that the second night, when she'd made a stew with the last of the good vegetables from her own careful rationing, he had gone still over his bowl for a long moment before saying, quiet and almost embarrassed, that it tasted like something his mother used to make. She noticed, too, that he never once in all those first days mentioned her size, not to praise her competence, in spite of it, the way she'd half expected, and not to disparage her for it either. He simply did not seem to see it as anything worth remarking on at all, which was, in its own strange way, the kindest thing anyone had done for her in longer than she could remember. But she noticed other things as well. She noticed the letters that came from First Trust Bank, which Ethan folded quickly and tucked away before she could read more than the letterhead. She noticed how his shoulders tightened whenever Victor Hale's name came up in town, which it did often whispered by Otis or muttered by Ethan himself when he thought she wasn't listening. She noticed the water rights filing he'd brushed off in the church, which he still had not explained. And on the 6th morning, riding into town beside Ethan for supplies, sitting stiff and proud on the wagon seat, while the townsfolk watched her pass, with the same open curiosity as her first day, Clara noticed something else entirely. Something that made her blood go cold and her mind sharp and careful, begin turning over facts the way she had learned to turn over facts her whole life, searching for the lie hidden inside the truth. Because there, tacked to the board outside the bank, freshly posted, was a notice with Ethan Walker's name on it, and beneath his name in bold black letters that Clara read twice, to be certain she hadn't misunderstood, was a filing date for the very water rights Victor Hale had mentioned at the wedding. A filing date that, according to the paper, had been submitted 3 weeks after Ethan claimed he'd filed it. Clara said nothing to Ethan as they loaded the wagon with flour and salt and the other small necessities of a life still finding its shape. She said nothing as they rode back out of town, the mountains gray and distant, against a sky gone the color of a bruise. But she folded the knowledge away carefully, the same way she'd folded away every hard-won piece of armor in her life, and she thought with a certainty that surprised her, that whatever quiet arrangement she and Ethan Walker had settled into it was about to be tested by something far larger than either of them had bargained for. Clara did not sleep that night. She lay in the narrow bed beneath the faded quilt and stared at the ceiling, running the numbers over in her mind, the way she used to run figures at her father's dry goods counter, back before her father died and the counter passed to a cousin who did not want her standing behind it anymore. 3 weeks. The filing on the board outside the bank claimed Ethan had submitted his water rights paperwork 3 weeks after the date he'd told her, weeks after the date that would have kept his claim valid under whatever county rule governed such things. She did not yet understand the rule. She understood only that a discrepancy of 3 weeks in the hands of a man like Victor Hale was not an accident. Men like Hale did not deal in accidents. They dealt in advantages manufactured quietly and slipped into place while everyone else was too busy surviving to notice. She rose before dawn, same as she had every morning since arriving, and found Ethan already in the kitchen, hunched over a ledger with a cup of coffee gone cold beside his elbow. He looked up when she came in, and something in his face told her he hadn't slept much either. "You're up early," he said. "Same as you, it seems." Clara crossed to the stove and began building up the fire, more out of habit than hunger. Ledger troubles. Ledger troubles. He rubbed the heel of his hand against his eye. "Ain't never been much good with figures. Numbers just sit there looking back at me like they know something I don't." Clara glanced over her shoulder at the columns spread across the table upside down from where she stood, and something in her settled into place the way it always did when a problem presented itself plainly enough to solve. "May I?" she asked, nodding toward the ledger. Ethan's brow furrowed. "You keep books?" "I kept my father's books for 6 years before he passed. Dry goods store back home. He said I had a head for figures he never had himself." She said it plainly, without pride, the way she'd learned to say most true things about herself flatly, so no one could accuse her of boasting. "I could look if you'd let me." He hesitated. Clara watched the hesitation and understood it for what it was. Not distrust of her specifically, but the particular stubbornness of a man who had spent so many years alone that the idea of handing his troubles to someone else felt like handing over a piece of himself he wasn't sure he'd get back. "Suit yourself," he said finally, and pushed the ledger across the table. Clara sat, turned the book right side up, and began to read. It took her the better part of 20 minutes, Ethan pretending to busy himself with his coffee while watching her from the corner of his eye the whole time before she looked up. "You've been paying interest twice on the same loan," she said. Ethan blinked. "What?" "Here." She turned the ledger to face him, tapping 2 entries a page apart. "This payment in March and this one in April, they're both marked against the same note number. Either the bank's double billing you, which happens more than folks like to admit, or someone in that office made an error and never caught it." "That's—" He leaned forward, squinting at the numbers like they might rearrange themselves if he looked hard enough. "That's near $40. $42, Clara said. "I'd want to see the original note before I said it with certainty. But if I'm right, that's $42 you don't owe sitting in First Trust's pocket instead of yours." Ethan sat back, slowly staring at her with an expression Clara hadn't seen on him yet. Not gratitude exactly, not surprise exactly, but something that lived in the space between the two, a kind of stunned recalculation, like a man realizing the ground beneath him was sturdier than he'd thought. $42, he said again, quieter. "It's not nothing," Clara said. "Not with a drought on." "No." He shook his head slowly. "No, ma'am, it surely ain't." That was the first mini-victory, small and quiet, the kind that didn't announce itself with fanfare, but Clara felt it settle into the space between them like the first stone laid for a foundation. She did not tell him about the notice at the bank. Not yet. She wanted more before she brought that particular trouble to his door, more facts, more certainty, something more solid than a filing date and a bad feeling. She got her chance to gather more 3 days later when Otis went down. It happened fast, the way real trouble always did. No warning, no slow build, just Otis climbing down from the hayloft with an armful of feed and his boot catching wrong on the ladder rung, and then he was on the ground, gray-faced, clutching his side and cursing in a voice tight with pain he was trying too hard to hide. "I'm fine," he kept saying, even as Ethan and Clara half carried him into the house. "Just knocked the wind out of me is all. Ain't nothin'." "You're bleeding through your shirt," Clara said flat and unimpressed by his protests, already reaching for the scissors in her sewing kit. "That's just a scratch. Otis Graham, I have birthed calves smaller than the fuss you're making." Clara cut the shirt away from his side with quick, practiced movements, and the wound beneath it made even Ethan go quiet, a gash along his ribs deep enough to need more than a bandage, the skin around it already darkening. "We need Doc Reeves," Ethan said, already moving toward the door. "Town's an hour out, maybe less if I push the horse." "There isn't time for that," Clara said without looking up. "Not for this. Infection sets in faster than an hour-and-a-half round trip, and if that rib's cracked, jostling him in a wagon all the way to town could do worse than the fall already did." Ethan stopped in the doorway. Then what do you propose? Clara was already moving, pulling open the cabinet where she'd stored the small bundle of dried herbs she'd brought with her from home yarrow plantain. A few things her mother had taught her before her mother had stopped speaking to her much at all. I need boiling water, and whiskey if you have it. For the wound. For the wound and for him, because this is going to hurt considerably before it hurts less. Clara glanced at Otis, who had gone the particular shade of pale that meant he was too proud to admit how much pain he was in. Otis, I need you to trust me. Can you do that? Otis managed a weak, strained smile. Ma'am, at this point, you're the only one in this room who seems to know what they're doing. Reckon trustin' you is the smart play. It took the better part of an hour. Clara working with a steadiness that surprised even herself, cleaning the wound, packing it with yarrow to slow the bleeding. Stitching what needed stitching with a needle she'd sterilized in the boiling water, all while Ethan held Otis's shoulders down and murmured low, steady words that Clara couldn't quite hear, but understood the shape of anyway, the particular register men used when they were trying to be strong for someone they loved without letting on how frightened they were. When it was done, and Otis lay pale but breathing evenly in the small room off the kitchen, Clara sat back on her heels and let out a long breath of her own. Ethan was watching her. He'd been watching her for the better part of the last 20 minutes, she realized in the particular silence of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. Where'd you learn that? He asked quietly. My mother. Clara wiped her hands on a clean cloth, her fingers finally beginning to shake now that the urgency had passed. She lost 2 children before me, learned everything she could about doctoring after that, out of fear more than anything else. Made sure I learned it too. That wasn't nothing you learned from a book. No, Clara agreed. Some of it was, but most of it was watching her hands and remembering. Ethan looked at Otis sleeping. Now his color better than it had been an hour before, and then back at Clara, and something in his face had shifted. Not dramatically, not in a way anyone else would have noticed. But Clara noticed because she had spent her whole life learning to read the smallest shifts in people's faces. The tells that told her whether a room was safe or not. I owe you, he said. You don't owe me anything. He's your friend. I wasn't about to let him bleed out on the barn floor over pride. Still, Ethan's jaw worked. Man doesn't forget something like that. Clara looked at him for a long moment and found herself for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach, wanting to say something honest, something that wasn't armor, wasn't deflection, wasn't the careful, guarded politeness she'd been offering since Red Willow first laughed at her. I'm glad I could help, she said instead, because honesty she'd learned was a thing you doled out slowly in small amounts until you were certain the person receiving it wouldn't use it against you. That night, after Otis had been settled with enough broth and instruction to keep him resting, Ethan found her on the back porch, sitting on the top step, with her shawl pulled tight against the evening chill, looking out at land she was slowly starting to understand the shape of. Mind if I sit? He asked. It's your porch, Mr. Walker. Ethan? He corrected, easing himself down onto the step beside her, close enough that Clara was aware of it, but not so close it felt like a claim on her space. Figure we're past Mr. Walker given the day you've had. Clara allowed herself a small smile. Ethan, then. They sat in silence for a while, the crickets loud in the dark, the horses shifting in the corral, and Clara found the quiet between them different than it had been on the wagon that first day. Not the silence of 2 strangers with nothing to say, but the silence of 2 people who had without quite meaning to started building something between them out of small moments neither of them had asked for. Can I tell you something? Ethan said finally, his voice lower than usual, the words coming slow, like he was testing each one before he let it out into the open. Of course, I didn't want a wife. He stared out at the dark shape of the mountains. Not really. Wrote that letter to the agency 'cause the bank was breathing down my neck, and I didn't see another way. And I told myself it'd be a business arrangement plain as any other deal I'd struck, and I wouldn't let it be nothing more than that. He was quiet a moment. Truth is, I had a girl once, back before the drought, before any of this. Sarah Whitfield. Was set to marry her, had the date picked and everything. Clara went very still, sensing the shape of something painful approaching. What happened? Ranch hit hard times first bad year of the drought, and her family got wind I might lose the place. She broke it off 2 weeks before the wedding. Told me straight out she couldn't marry a man who might not have 2 nickels to rub together come winter. His voice was carefully flat, the flatness of a man who had practiced saying the words so many times they no longer cut as deep as they once had, though Clara suspected they still cut plenty. Married a fella from Cheyenne instead. Banker's son. Sends me a Christmas card every year, if you can believe that. Like we're still friendly. Moby desu boy. That's cruel, Clara said quietly. That's practical, Ethan said. That's how most folks are when it comes down to it. Ain't cruelty exactly, just arithmetic. Woman's gotta think about her future same as anybody. He turned to look at her, and in the dim light from the kitchen window, his eyes were unreadable. So when I wrote that letter, I told myself I wanted someone who wouldn't run at the first sign of trouble, someone practical, someone who wasn't marrying me for romance because I didn't have any left in me to offer. And instead you got me, Clara said, and there was no bitterness in it, only a kind of wry acknowledgement. Instead I got you, Ethan agreed. And I'll tell you something else, Clara Whitmore 3 weeks ago. If you'd told me the woman stepping off that stagecoach would fix my ledger, save Otis's life, and make cornbread better than my own mother's, I'd have called you a liar. Clara felt something warm bloom in her chest, unfamiliar, and a little frightening in its unfamiliarity. Is that your way of saying you're glad the agency didn't send someone thinner? Ethan huffed out something that was almost a laugh, the first real laugh she'd heard from him, short and surprised, like it had escaped before he could stop it. That's my way of saying I judged wrong. About a lot of things, maybe, including you. They sat with that for a moment, the confession hanging in the air between them, fragile as new ice on a pond. And Clara understood that this was the closest thing to tenderness Ethan Walker knew how to offer, and that it was worth more coming from him than pretty words would have been from another man. She almost told him about the water rights filing then. The moment felt right for it soft-edged and honest, but she held back some careful instinct, warning her that she needed more than a filing date before she brought him a fight he wasn't ready to hear about, and so she let the moment pass, tucking the honesty away for later, the way she'd tucked away every hard truth she'd ever carried. The town, however, was not finished with its cruelty, and the next reminder of it came only 2 days later, when Ethan announced they'd been expected at the church social, a monthly gathering Clara had heard Otis mention in passing, the kind of event where the whole of Red Willow turned out to eat too much pie and gossip about everyone who wasn't present to defend themselves. We don't have to go, Ethan said, watching her face carefully as she considered her one good dress laid out across the bed. I can tell Thomas we've got sickness in the house with Otis laid up. Wouldn't be a lie, not entirely. No. Clara smoothed the fabric with steady hands, though her stomach had already begun its familiar knot. No, we'll go. If I hide every time this town decides to be cruel, I'll spend the rest of my life hiding. I'd rather face it standing up. Ethan studied her for a long moment. You're a stubborn woman, Clara Walker. It was the first time he'd used her married name, and something about hearing it in his voice, steady matter-of-fact, without a trace of mockery, settled something in her chest that she hadn't realized had been unsettled. The social was held in the churchyard long tables set up under the open sky. The whole town turned out in their good clothes, children chasing each other between the legs of adults too busy talking to notice. Clara felt the eyes find her the moment the wagon rolled to a stop, felt the whispers begin before she'd even climbed down, and steadied herself with a breath before stepping into it. There she is, Agnes Collier said to the woman beside her, not troubling to lower her voice, the same way she hadn't troubled to lower it on Clara's first day in town. Surprised the wagon axle held. The woman beside Agnes tittered, and Clara felt her face go hot, but she kept walking, kept her chin level the way she'd taught herself years ago in a different town, with different cruel women wearing different faces, but saying essentially the same tired things. Mrs. Walker. Preacher Thomas approached with genuine warmth, extending his hand, and Clara took it gratefully, glad for one friendly face in the crowd. So glad you could join us. Heard tell you did some fine doctoring on Otis Graham. Man's got nothing but praise for you around town. He's kind to say so, Clara said. It wasn't much. Wasn't much, she says. Thomas shook his head, smiling. Doc Reeves himself said he couldn't have stitched that wound cleaner. High praise coming from him. Clara felt a flush of pride, quiet and warm, but it didn't survive long past Thomas's departure, because no sooner had he moved off to greet another family than Agnes Collier drifted close, her expression arranged into something that might have passed to an untrained eye as friendliness. Mrs. Walker. Agnes's smile was thin as paper. How are you finding ranch life? Must be quite the adjustment coming from town. I'm finding it well enough, Clara said evenly. Thank you for asking. I'm sure. Agnes's eyes flicked over her, the same slow, assessing crawl Clara had endured since her first moment in Red Willow. You know, I did wonder when I heard Ethan had gone and gotten himself a mail-order bride, what sort of woman would answer such an advertisement. Desperate women mostly, in my experience. Women who couldn't find a husband any other way. The words landed exactly where Agnes intended them to land, and Clara felt the old familiar sting rise up in her chest, the sting of every room she'd ever stood in where someone had decided her body was an invitation to cruelty. I answered it, Clara said, keeping her voice level, because I wanted a fresh start. I imagine most people who cross 200 miles of hard country want the same thing, Mrs. Collier. Desperation seems an unkind word for it. Oh, I meant nothing unkind. Agnes's smile widened sharp at the edges. I only wonder what Ethan Walker was thinking is all. A man like that, handsome, hard-working, could have had his pick of any woman in 3 counties, drought or no drought. And he settles for... She let the sentence trail off, her eyes dropping pointedly to Clara's waist, and back up again, the implication louder than any word could have made it. The churchyard around them had gone quieter, Clara realized. Not silent, but quieter. The particular hush of people pretending not to listen, while listening very closely indeed. Settles for what, Mrs. Collier? Clara asked, and something in her voice must have carried an edge Agnes hadn't expected, because the older woman's smile flickered just slightly. Well, Agnes said, recovering herself, I only meant... You meant to say it plainly and then decided against it because plain cruelty doesn't sound so pretty said out loud in front of the preacher's wife. Clara held her gaze steady, unblinking. I'll say it for you if it'll spare you the trouble. You think Ethan Walker settled for a fat woman because no thin one would have him given his troubles with the bank. Is that closer to it? A ripple moved through the small crowd that had gathered without quite meaning to a collective intake of breath, and Agnes's face went a mottled shade of red. I never said... You didn't have to say it, Clara said. You've been saying it with your eyes since I stepped off that stagecoach. I've spent my whole life around women like you, Mrs. Collier, and I've learned there's only one way to answer it, which is plainly so. There's no mistaking my meaning, the way there's never any mistaking yours. She took a slow breath, feeling something steady and hot settle into place behind her ribs. Not anger exactly, but its close cousin, the kind of resolve that came from being pushed one too many times. I am not ashamed of my body. I've done more honest work with these hands in 3 weeks than half this churchyard's done in 3 months, if the state of some of these gardens is anything to judge by. And whatever Ethan Walker did or didn't settle for, that's a conversation between him and me, not one I owe you an accounting of over pie. The silence that followed was absolute. Somewhere behind her, Clara heard a low, startled cough that might have been someone trying not to laugh, and beyond that, she was aware, acutely, uncomfortably aware, that Ethan had come to stand at her shoulder sometime during the exchange. Close enough now that she could feel the warmth of him beside her. My wife, Ethan said into the silence, his voice carrying easily across the yard. Asked you a question, Agnes. Seems only polite you answer it, stead of standin' there like you swallowed your own tongue. Agnes's mouth opened and closed twice before she managed weakly. I'm sure I don't know what you mean, Ethan. I mean, you've been running your mouth about my wife since the day she arrived, and I've let it slide more than I should have out of respect for Thomas and this church. Ethan's voice hadn't risen, but something in it had gone hard, unmistakable. That respect's about run its course. You got something to say about Clara. You say it where I can hear it plain, or you keep it to yourself. Those are the only two choices you got left." Agnes looked between the two of them, her face working through several expressions before settling on something like wounded dignity. "Well," she said, "I never." And then, apparently unable to find a satisfactory end to the sentence, she turned and walked away. Her back rigid, several of the women who'd been standing nearby drifting quietly after her, though Clara noted with some private satisfaction that at least two of them cast her a small approving glance before they went. Ethan turned to her once the crowd had begun to disperse back into its earlier conversations. The moment's drama already dissolving into the ordinary business of the social. "You didn't need my help with that." He said something like admiration in his voice. "You had her on the ropes before I ever opened my mouth." "Maybe," Clara said. "But it was good of you to stand beside me anyway." "Told you before." Ethan settled his hat with 2 fingers, the same gesture she'd come to recognize as the punctuation mark he used when he meant something firmly. "Nobody drags my wife through the dirt. Starting to think that's true whether I like the sound of the word wife attached to your name or not." Clara looked up at him, startled by the phrasing, and found him watching her with an expression she hadn't seen from him before, something warmer than the careful neutrality he'd offered since her arrival, something that made her pulse quicken in a way that had nothing to do with fear. "And do you?" she asked before she could stop herself. "Like the sound of it?" Ethan didn't answer right away. He looked at her for a long moment, the churchyard noise fading into background around them, and something passed between them that neither of them had words ready for yet. "Ask me again sometime," he said, finally quiet, "when I've had more practice answerin' honest." It wasn't a yes, but it wasn't a no either, and Clara found herself carrying the weight of that unfinished answer home with her, turning it over in her mind, the way she'd once turned over her father's figures, searching for the sum hidden inside it. The reprieve did not last. 2 days after the social, Clara rode into town alone for the first time, ostensibly for thread and needles, but in truth because the notice at the bank had not stopped gnawing at her, and she'd resolved to learn more of it before another week passed. The county recorder's office was a narrow building, squeezed between the bank and the mercantile, run by a thin, nervous man named Mr. Ferris, who startled visibly when Clara stepped through his door. "Mrs. Walker." He straightened his spectacles. "What can I do for you?" "I'd like to see the filing records for water rights along the eastern boundary of Walker Land," Clara said, keeping her voice pleasant, unremarkable, the voice of a woman making an ordinary request. "My husband mentioned some confusion over dates, and I thought I might clear it up myself, save him the trouble." Mr. Ferris's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the street outside, in a way that made Clara's instincts sharpen. "I'm not certain that is those records aren't typically made available to wives," Clara asked, mild as milk. "Or to anyone at all, Mr. Ferris." He flushed. "It's public record, ma'am, technically. I only meant, then I'd be obliged if you'd show it to me." Clara smiled the smile she'd learned years ago behind her father's counter, the one that made difficult customers feel as though refusing her would be more trouble than it was worth. "It'll only take a moment." Mr. Ferris hesitated a moment longer, then disappeared into the back room, returning with a heavy ledger that he set on the counter with visible reluctance. Clara turned the pages, carefully scanning entries, until she found the one she sought. Ethan Walker, water rights renewal, eastern parcel, and there it was in ink that looked to her careful eye subtly different from the entries around it. Darker, fresher. "This entry," she said, slowly tapping the page. "When was this ledger page written?" I couldn't say, ma'am. I only keep the records, I don't." "Mr. Ferris." Clara looked up at him, and something in her gaze must have carried more weight than she intended, because the thin man's composure cracked visibly. "I am not accusing you of anything. I am asking you as one honest person to another, whether this entry looks correct to you. Compare the ink. Compare the hand." Mr. Ferris leaned over the ledger, and Clara watched his face change as he really looked at what she was showing him. He swallowed hard. "That entry's been altered, Mrs. Walker. I didn't write that." I mean, I did write the original filing back in the spring, but this—" He jabbed a trembling finger at the page. "This date's been changed. Someone's gone over my original numbers with a different pen." Clara felt her pulse pick up the particular thrill of a suspicion confirmed. "Who has access to this ledger, Mr. Ferris?" "Myself, the county clerk." He hesitated, and Clara watched the hesitation waited for. It knew instinctively what was coming before he said it. "And Mr. Hale on occasion. He's a generous contributor to the county offices. Comes by regular checkin' on land matters east of the river. I never thought to question it. Man like that with his standin' has legitimate reasons for reviewing county records," Clara finished for him, "and also every reason in the world to want my husband's water rights to lapse." Mr. Ferris's face had gone the color of old paper. "Mrs. Walker, I can't be seen saying anything against Mr. Hale. He's got friends on the county board. He's got friends at the bank. A man in my position, I've got a family to feed." "I understand," Clara said. And she did understand more than he knew. Understood the particular fear of a small person standing between a powerful man and what he wanted. "I'm not asking you to accuse anyone, Mr. Ferris. I'm only asking you to remember if anyone should ever ask you directly what you told me here today. Can you do that much?" He looked at her for a long moment, torn between fear and something that might have been conscience, and finally gave a small tight nod. "I can remember it," he said quietly. "I won't say it loud, but I can remember it." It would have to be enough for now. Clara rode home with the knowledge sitting heavy and sharp in her chest, turning over how to tell Ethan what words might soften a truth that could not in the end be softened at all, that the man who'd clapped at their wedding, who'd smiled with a knife hidden behind his teeth, was quietly, methodically stealing the ground out from under them. She found Ethan in the barn when she arrived, mending a length of fence rail with the particular focus of a man who used physical work to keep his mind from wandering somewhere he didn't want it to go. He looked up when she came in, and something in her face must have told him this wasn't an ordinary homecoming, because he set down his tools immediately. "What's wrong?" Clara took a breath, steadying herself, and told him everything from the notice on the board outside the bank on her 6th morning in Red Willow, to the ledger in Mr. Ferris's office, to the altered ink she'd seen with her own eyes not an hour before. Ethan listened without interrupting, his face growing harder and more still with every word, until by the time she finished, he looked like a man carved from stone. "You should have told me sooner," he said finally, his voice tight. "I didn't want to bring you a fight before I had something solid to bring it with," Clara said. "A filing date and a bad feeling isn't proof, Ethan. I needed more before I laid this at your door. And now you got more. Now I've got a county clerk who's terrified of Victor Hale and ink that doesn't match, and no proof strong enough yet to stand up in front of a judge." Clara stepped closer, her voice steady despite the pounding of her heart. "But I've got enough to know we're not imagining trouble, Ethan. Hale means to take this ranch, and he's using the water rights to do it. If those rights lapse, I lose access to the river that waters every head of cattle I got left." Ethan's jaw was tight enough that Clara could see the muscle jumping beneath the stubble. "Lose the river, lose the cattle I can't pay the bank. Lose the ranch to the bank, and I'd bet my last dollar Hale's first in line to buy it up cheap once it's sold at auction." He shook his head slowly, something bitter and exhausted moving across his face. "Man's been circling this land for 2 years. Should have seen it coming the second he showed up at our wedding uninvited." "We're seeing it now," Clara said. "That's what matters." Ethan looked at her, something shifting in his expression, the particular look of a man recalculating again everything he thought he understood about the woman standing in front of him. "3 weeks ago," he said slowly, "I married a stranger to keep the bank off my back for another season. Didn't figure on much beyond that." His eyes held hers steady and searching. "Didn't figure I'd end up owing the same stranger my whole ranch twice over before the summer was out." "You don't owe me anything," Clara said again, the same words she'd offered him after Otis, though this time they felt different in her mouth, less like deflection, more like something she genuinely believed and wanted him to believe too. I'm your wife, Ethan. Whatever that word means to either of us right now, it means I don't stand by while someone tries to take what's yours. What's ours? Ethan corrected quiet, and Clara felt the word land somewhere deep and unguarded in her chest. A small crack in the careful walls she'd built around herself since the day she'd first learned that her body invited cruelty faster than kindness. Ours, she agreed softly. They stood there a moment, the barn quiet around them, the weight of what they'd learned settling into the space between them alongside something else. Something neither of them had words for yet, but which had been growing steadily since that first defiant handshake in the street. Through fixed ledgers and stitched wounds, and a churchyard confrontation neither of them had backed down from. We need more proof, Clara said, finally pulling her thoughts back to the problem at hand. Ferris is afraid, and rightly so, but fear can be outweighed by facts if we find enough of them. Someone else must have handled that filing, a witness. Something written in Hale's own hand, even if we're fortunate. County seat's 2 days' ride from here, Ethan said. Original filing might have gone through there first before it ever reached Ferris's office. Then that's where we start. Ethan studied her for a long moment, something like wonder mixed in with the exhaustion on his face. You've known me 3 weeks, he said, and you're fixin' to ride 2 days into open country to save a ranch that ain't even rightfully yours to lose. It's rightfully mine the moment I said I do in that church, Clara said, lifting her chin the way she had on her very first day in Red Willow, the gesture that had by now become as familiar to Ethan as her own hands. Whatever else this marriage is or isn't, Ethan Walker, I don't intend to be a wife who sits quietly by while her home is stolen out from under her. I've spent enough of my life being underestimated. I'd rather spend what's left of it proving people wrong. Something in Ethan's face broke open. Then, not sadness, not quite joy either, but something adjacent to both raw and unguarded in a way she hadn't seen from him since the wedding. Sarah never once offered to fight for anything of mine, he said quietly. Ran at the first sign trouble might cost her something. He shook his head slowly, like a man still working out the arithmetic of his own surprise. You've been here 3 weeks, and you're ready to ride into open country for me. Not for you, Clara said, though her voice wasn't quite as steady as she wanted it to be. For us. For this ranch. For a home I'd like to keep having, if it's all the same to you. Ethan reached out slow and careful, the way he'd reached for her hand that very first day in town, and this time when his fingers closed around hers, Clara did not pull away. 2 days' ride, he said. We'll leave at first light. Otis still healing, but well enough to grumble about being left behind, insisted on seeing them off the next morning with a litany of instructions neither of them had time to follow, and a promise to keep watch over the ranch in their absence. You two be careful, he said, leaning heavily on the fence post, his side still bandaged beneath his shirt. Hale's men have been seen out past the eastern boundary more than usual lately. Don't like the timing of it, you two riding off just when things are heating up. We'll be careful, Ethan said, checking the cinch on his horse one last time. And you? Otis turned to Clara, his weathered face softening in a way that made something warm settle in her chest. You take care of my friend out there, Mrs. Walker. Man stubborn as a mule, and twice as likely to get himself into trouble trying to prove he don't need help. I'll manage him, Clara said, smiling despite the tension coiled tight in her stomach. Reckon you will at that. Otis's eyes crinkled at the corners. Never seen him smile as much as he has these past few weeks, you know. Not since before Sarah Whitfield broke his heart. Don't know what you did to him, ma'am, but whatever it is, keep doing it. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, glancing toward Ethan, who was suddenly very focused on his saddlebags, his ears gone faintly red beneath his hat. We should ride, he said gruffly, before Otis embarrasses us both clean into next week. They set out as the sun climbed over the eastern ridge, the ranch shrinking behind them, the open country stretching wide and golden and dangerous ahead. Clara rode astride she'd insisted on it over Ethan's initial protest, pointing out with unassailable logic that side saddle would slow them by hours they didn't have to spare, and found within the first mile that the rhythm of the horse beneath her was steadying, in a way she hadn't expected, something almost meditative in the long, even miles unspooling ahead. They talked as they rode, not constantly, but in the easy, intermittent way of two people growing comfortable in each other's silences as much as their conversation. Ethan told her about the ranch as it had been in his father's time before the drought, when the grass grew tall enough to hide a grown man standing in it. Clara told him about her father's store, about counting coins behind the counter, while her mother worried over her weight in the next room, about the particular loneliness of growing up in a body the world had already decided to judge before it ever bothered to know her. "Never understood that," Ethan said at one point, his eyes fixed on the horizon. "Judging a person for you know the first thing about who they are. Man can be the meanest sort you ever met and still be thin as a fence post. Don't seem to signify much of anything's size." "Try telling that to Red Willow," Clara said with a wry twist to her mouth. "Might just do that," Ethan said, and something in his tone told her he meant it. They made camp that evening in a shallow draw sheltered from the worst of the wind, and Clara found herself for the first time since her arrival entirely at ease in Ethan's company. No longer the careful, guarded stranger of that first wagon ride, but something closer to a partner, an equal, a woman who had earned her place beside him through 6 weeks of proving herself in ways neither of them had anticipated. It was well past dark. The fire burned down to embers when they heard the horses. Clara went still first, her instincts sharpening before her mind fully caught up to what her ears were telling her. Ethan's hand found the rifle beside him without hesitation, his body coiling into a stillness that was entirely different from the easy relaxation of moments before. "Get behind me," he said low. "Ethan, Clara." His voice brooked no argument, and something in the sharpness of it made her obey without further protest, moving to press her back against the rock outcropping behind them as 3 riders emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, their faces shadowed beneath low-pulled hats, their intentions unmistakable in the deliberate, unhurried way they approached. "Evenin' Walker," the lead rider said, and Clara recognized something familiar in the mocking pleasantness of his tone, the same tone Victor Hale had used at their wedding, dressed now in a rougher voice, but cut from the same cloth entirely. "You're on the wrong side of the county line for a friendly visit," Ethan said, rifle steady in his hands, his voice betraying none of the tension Clara could feel radiating off him. "State your business or ride on." The lead rider's smile was visible even in the dim firelight, sharp and unpleasant. "Mr. Hale sends his regards," he said. "Wanted us to make sure you understood something plain and simple. That county seat you're riding toward ain't gonna find what you're looking for there. Records got a way of disappearing out here in open country. Real shame how unreliable paperwork can be." Clara's blood went cold. They knew. Somehow, impossibly, Hale already knew exactly what they were riding to find, which meant either Mr. Ferris had talked, or someone had been watching them far more closely than either of them had realized. The rider's eyes shifted past Ethan, finding Clara in the shadows, and his smile widened into something that made her skin crawl. "Evenin', Mrs. Walker," he said, tipping his hat with mocking courtesy. "Awful long way from home for a woman in your condition, if you don't mind me saying so." "I do mind," Clara said, stepping forward despite Ethan's low warning sound refusing to let fear keep her hidden, the way it had once kept her hidden in 100 other rooms. "And you can tell Mr. Hale that whatever he thinks he's hiding at that county seat, we intend to find it, records or no records, threats or no threats." The rider's smile faltered, just slightly surprised by the steel in her voice, and Clara felt a fierce, unexpected satisfaction at the sight of it. "Brave words," he said, recovering, "for a woman standing in open country after dark." "Ride on," Ethan said again, his voice gone hard, as Flint the rifle never wavering. "Or the next words spoken here won't be words at all." For a long, taut moment, nobody moved. Clara could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears, could feel Ethan's tension radiating beside her like heat off a stove. And then finally the lead rider gave a short, mocking laugh and pulled his horse's head around. "We'll be seeing you, Walker," he said. "Sooner than you think, I reckon." The 3 riders vanished back into the darkness, the sound of their hooves fading slowly into the vast quiet of the open country, and Clara let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. "They know where we're headed," she said, her voice unsteady now that the immediate danger had passed. How could they possibly know? Ethan lowered the rifle slowly, his jaw tight, his eyes still fixed on the darkness where the riders had disappeared. Someone talked, he said grimly. Or someone's been watching the ranch closer than we realized. He turned to look at her, and in the dim firelight, Clara could see real fear in his eyes, for the first time since she'd known him. Not fear for himself, she understood instinctively, but fear for her. Clara, if Hale's willing to send men after us in open country over paperwork, then we know for certain he's got something worth hiding. Clara finished, steadying her own voice through sheer force of will. Men don't send riders to threaten strangers over nothing, Ethan. Whatever's waiting at that county seat, it's real, and it's dangerous enough that Hale's willing to risk violence to keep us from finding it. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, staring into the dying embers of their fire. Maybe we should turn back, he said finally, though Clara could hear how little he believed the words, even as he said them. Maybe this ain't worth the risk. Ranch is just land in the end. He stopped, swallowed hard. You're worth more to me than any acre of it. Clara felt something crack open in her chest at those words, unexpected and overwhelming, and she reached across the small distance between them to take his hand, the way he'd taken hers in the barn 2 days before. We're not turning back, she said quietly, firmly. Ethan, listen to me. I have spent my whole life being told in 1,000 small and large ways that I don't matter enough to fight for. That my worth is negotiable, dependent on what I look like, what I weigh, what rooms I'm allowed into, without someone laughing. I am done letting people like Victor Hale decide what gets taken and what gets kept. Her grip tightened on his hand. This ranch is yours. It's ours now, and I will not let a man who forges county records and sends riders to threaten a woman in the dark take it from us without a fight. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something fierce and tender moving across his face in equal measure. And then slowly he lifted her hand and pressed his lips to her knuckles, the first genuinely tender gesture he'd offered her since her arrival. Careful and searching, like a question he wasn't yet sure he had the right to ask. Never met a woman like you, he said quietly. Reckon I don't rightly know what to do with that. You don't have to know, Clara said, her own voice unsteady now. You just have to keep riding beside me. That's enough for now. They broke camp before first light, the next morning. The encounter with Hale's riders sitting heavy between them, sharpening their resolve rather than dampening it. The county seat was still a full day's ride, distant, the land growing rougher as they traveled the mountains, drawing closer on the horizon, like a wall between them and whatever answers waited on the other side. It was mid-afternoon when they crested a ridge and saw in the valley below a plume of smoke rising from a direction that made Ethan go rigid in his saddle. That's not campfire smoke, he said, his voice gone tight. That's too much smoke for that. Where's it coming from? Ethan's face had drained of color beneath his tan. That's the direction of home, he said. Clara, that's coming from the direction of the ranch. The world seemed to tilt beneath Clara for one long terrible moment, every fear she'd carried since the riders appeared in the darkness, crystallizing into something sharp and certain. Otis, she whispered. Ethan was already turning his horse, already digging his heels in, already moving faster than Clara had ever seen him move, and she followed without hesitation, her heart hammering against her ribs as the ranch, and whatever waited for them, there drew closer with every desperate mile. The ride back took less than half the time. The ride out had taken both horses lathered and blowing hard by the time the ranch came into view. And what Clara saw in that first terrible glimpse over the ridge stole the air clean out of her lungs. The hayfield was burning, not the house she registered that with a flood of relief so sharp it nearly buckled her in the saddle, but the near pasture and the edge of the barn, orange flame chewing through dry summer grass with a hunger that came from weeks without rain, black smoke rolling up into the sky in a column that could probably be seen from town. Otis! Ethan's voice tore out of him raw and desperate as they came down off the ridge at a dead run, and Clara had never heard a sound like it from him before, not once in 6 weeks, not even in the darkness with 3 riders bearing down on them. They found Otis near the well, soot-streaked and coughing, dragging a bucket in each hand, with the stubborn determination of a man twice his age, refusing to quit his bandaged side, visibly straining with every movement. Otis. Clara was off her horse before it had fully stopped catching the old man's arm as his knees buckled. You shouldn't be moving like this, your wound. Wound can wait. Otis's voice was a rasp, his eyes streaming from smoke, but there was fire in them that had nothing to do with the flames behind him. Barnes, what can't wait? Get more buckets, we still got a chance at saving the loft if we— Who did this? Ethan's voice cut through hard and low, already moving toward the well, already hauling up water with the desperate speed of a man who understood every minute mattered. 3 riders. Came in from the east about 2 hours back. Otis coughed hard, doubling over, and Clara steadied him, even as her mind raced through everything that mattered, the fire, the timing, the men who had threatened them in the dark 2 nights before. Didn't even try to hide their faces. That's what got me worried, Ethan. Man doesn't bother hiding his face, lest he don't figure you'll live to describe him. Did they hurt you? Clara demanded, checking him over even as he tried to wave her off. Took a rifle butt to the shoulder trying to keep him off the barn. Otis grimaced. Weren't trying to kill me near as I could tell. Just wanted to send a message. Torched the hay, took a shot at the water trough to spook the cattle and rode off laughing like it was some kind of joke. Ethan's face had gone the particular shade of white that Clara had learned over 6 weeks meant fury too large for words. He didn't waste time on anger, though he was already moving, organizing his voice sharp with the clarity of a man who'd fought fires on this land before. Clara, buckets from the well. Otis, you sit down before you fall down. That's not a request. I'll cut the fence line, try to keep it from spreading toward the barn proper. They fought the fire for the better part of 2 hours. The 3 of them working with a grim, wordless efficiency, Clara's arms burning with exhaustion by the time the last of the flames finally guttered out against a fire break. Ethan had cut with an axe and sheer desperate strength. The hayfield was a blackened ruin. The edge of the barn had scorched but held, and when it was finally mercifully over, the 3 of them stood in the smoking wreckage, coughing filthy and alive. They wanted us to turn back, Clara said quietly, staring at the ruined field. That's what this was, not really trying to burn us out. A warning. Then they picked the wrong family to warn. Ethan's voice was flat dangerous in a way Clara hadn't heard from him before. He turned to Otis. You said 3 riders. Same 3 from the road. Couldn't say for certain. Didn't get a good look before the shooting started. Otis hesitated, then reached into his vest pocket with a wince. But I got something might help you figure it all the same. One of them dropped this when his horse spooked at the gunfire. Didn't even notice riding off. He held out a small brass token, the kind stamped for a company man, and Clara took it with hands that had gone very still. Engraved across the face, unmistakable, even under a layer of soot. Hale Cattle Company. That's not proof enough for a judge, Ethan said grimly. But it's proof enough for me. It's proof enough for both, Clara said, turning the token over in her fingers, feeling something settle into place inside her. Not fear anymore, but something colder and steadier. Ethan, this changes things. We can't wait for the county seat records now. If Hale's escalated to arson and assault, he's not going to stop at threats. We need to move faster than he expects. Ethan looked at her, and something passed between them, an understanding forged in 6 weeks of ledgers and stitched wounds and a churchyard confrontation sharpened now by smoke and fear and the brass token sitting cold in Clara's palm. County seat's still a day's ride, he said. We push through the night, we could be there by morning. Then we push through the night. Otis opened his mouth to protest, took one look at both their faces and closed it again. I'll hold things here, he said instead, quiet and resolute. Got Ethan's rifle, and I ain't so old I forgot how to use it. You 2 go on, get what you need. They rode through the darkness with a new urgency. The horses pushed harder than either of them liked, but faster than caution, allowed the events of the day burning in Clara's mind alongside the memory of the flames. Somewhere past midnight, Ethan finally broke the silence between them. You scared? He asked, his voice low against the dark. Terrified, Clara admitted. but not enough to stop. Good, Ethan said. Scared smart, stoppin' ain't. They reached the county seat as gray dawn was breaking over the low buildings clustered along a wider, busier street than Red Willow could boast a proper town with a proper courthouse, its white columns catching the first light. Clara's whole body ached with exhaustion, but her mind was sharper than it had been in days, every fact she'd gathered arranging itself into a shape she could almost see clearly now. The county recorder here was an older woman named Mrs. Pruitt, sharp-eyed and unhurried, who listened to Clara's request with none of Mr. Ferris's nervous evasion. Water rights filing Walker parcel eastern boundary. Mrs. Pruitt pulled a heavy volume from the shelf without hesitation, her manner brisk and businesslike. This the original filing, not the county copy sent out to Red Willow. Yes, ma'am, if you have it, Clara said, hope rising in her chest despite her exhaustion. Mrs. Pruitt found the page and turned the book around, and Clara leaned forward, her heart hammering, scanning the entry with desperate attention. There it was. The original date clear and unaltered in careful clerk's handwriting, the date Ethan had told her from the very beginning weeks before the fraudulent date that had appeared on the copy in Red Willow. This is it, Clara breathed. Ethan, look, the original filing is exactly when you said it was filed. Someone altered the copy that went to Ferris's office, not this one. Ethan leaned over the book, his jaw working, as he read the date twice, 3 times, like a man who needed to be certain before he let himself believe it. That's a full 3 weeks earlier than what's posted back home, he said, his voice tight, with something between relief and fury. Mrs. Pruitt, is there any way to prove when that copy was altered? Any record of who might have requested changes to county documents? Mrs. Pruitt's expression sharpened some of her brisk professionalism, giving way to genuine interest. There's a request ledger, she said slowly. Anyone asking for copies or amendments has to sign for it, state their business. Let me look. The wait felt endless. Clara's hands twisting together in her lap, Ethan pacing a slow, tight circuit near the window, until finally Mrs. Pruitt returned with a second ledger, thinner, but no less important. Here. She tapped a line with her finger, and Clara leaned in close enough to read it herself. Request for amended copy, Walker Water Rights filing eastern parcel. Signed for and requested by... Mrs. Pruitt's eyebrows rose slightly. Well, says here it was requested on behalf of First Trust Bank Red Willow Branch. Signature's a bit of a scrawl, but... Let me see, Ethan said, and Mrs. Pruitt turned the ledger toward him. Clara watched his face change as he read the signature, watched the color drain out of it, and then flood back in a hot, furious rush. That's not a bank signature, he said, his voice gone dangerously quiet. That's Victor Hale's own hand. I'd know it anywhere man signs contracts with me often enough trying to buy up my eastern acreage. He requested the amendment himself. Clara's mind raced, connecting the pieces with rapid, exhilarated clarity. Under the bank's name, but signed with his own hand. Ethan, that's not just fraud. That's proof he impersonated the bank to alter county records in his own favor. Mrs. Pruitt, listening to all of this with growing interest, finally spoke up herself. If that's true, Mrs. Walker, that's a serious matter indeed. Forging county documents impersonating a financial institution, that's not something the county judge takes lightly, especially not from a man of Hale's standing. Folks expect better from their prominent citizens, and when they find out they've been fooled, they tend to feel it sharply. Would you testify to what you've shown us? Clara asked. If it came to a formal hearing, Mrs. Pruitt considered this for a long moment, her sharp eyes moving between Clara and Ethan, taking their measure. I don't much care for men who think they can buy their way round the law, she said finally. I'll testify to what's written plain in my own ledgers. Can't speak to nothing beyond that, but the ledgers speak for themselves well enough, I'd wager. They left the county seat with copies of both documents carefully folded away. Clara's exhaustion forgotten beneath the fierce, singing satisfaction of having found exactly what they needed. But the ride home carried its own tension. Both of them watching the horizon more carefully than before, aware that Hale's men could be anywhere, that the fire at the ranch had proven exactly how far the man was willing to go. They stopped only briefly, pushing the horses as hard as mercy allowed, and it was well past dark on the second day when they finally crested the ridge above the ranch, relief flooding through Clara at the sight of the house still standing, lamplight glowing warm in the windows. Otis met them at the yard, looking better than he had 2 days before, though the strain of the intervening time showed in the tightness around his eyes. "Thank God," he breathed, taking the horse's reins as they dismounted stiff and saddle-sore. "Was starting to worry something fierce." "We're fine," Ethan said, though his voice carried the particular hoarseness of a man who'd ridden far longer than his body wanted to allow. "Any more trouble while we were gone?" "Quiet as church," Otis said. "Which worried me more than trouble would have, if I'm honest. Man like Hale don't go quiet unless he's planning something." Clara felt a chill move through her despite the warm night air, some instinct sharpening at Otis's words. "What do you mean?" Otis hesitated, then reached into his vest again, and this time what he produced made Clara's stomach drop clean through the floor. "Rider came by yesterday morning, left this nailed to the gatepost." He handed over a folded paper, and Ethan took it with hands that had gone suddenly unsteady. Clara read over his shoulder, and the words on the page seemed to burn themselves into her vision. Notice of foreclosure hearing. Property of Ethan Walker. Subject to review by County Bank Board, pursuant to concerns regarding water rights, filing irregularities, and outstanding debt. Hearing to be held publicly at Red Willow Town Hall 3 days hence, 10 o'clock in the morning. All interested parties invited to attend. 3 days. Ethan said, his voice hollow. He's not even waiting for the bank to come collectin' proper. He's forcing a public hearing using the very fraud he committed as the excuse to take the ranch out from under me. He's confident, Clara said slowly, her mind already racing ahead, turning the notice over and over, searching for the shape of the trap Hale had built. He thinks nobody will question his standing in this town. He thinks the water rights filing will hold up because nobody's looked closely enough to catch the fraud. She looked up at Ethan, something fierce and steady kindling in her chest, despite the exhaustion dragging at every limb. He doesn't know what we found at the county seat. 3 days ain't much time, Otis said. Judge Calloway presides over these hearings, comes down special from the county seat. Man's fair, far as I know, but he ain't gonna take kindly to accusations without solid proof, not against a man like Hale. We have solid proof, Clara said. We have the original filing date. We have the amendment request ledger with Hale's own signature. We have Mrs. Pruitt, who's willing to testify to what her own records show. She took a breath, feeling the weight of what was coming settle onto her shoulders heavy, but not crushing a burden she found to her own surprise she was ready to carry. What we need now is to make certain that proof reaches Judge Calloway's ears before Hale has the chance to bury it or twist it into something else. Ethan looked at her for a long moment, something raw and unguarded moving across his face. You really think we can beat him at this? I don't think it, Clara said. I know it. Men like Hale count on people being too frightened, too polite, or too underestimated to fight back. He's made every calculation except one. He never accounted for a wife who reads ledgers for a living and refuses to be laughed out of a room. Something like a smile tugged at the corner of Ethan's mouth, despite the exhaustion and fear etched into his features. Reckon he made that mistake the day he mocked you at our wedding. Reckon he did, Clara agreed. The 3 days that followed passed in a blur of careful preparation, Clara and Ethan working late into each night, organizing the evidence, writing out a clear account of everything they'd discovered, while Otis rode quietly between the ranch and town, gathering what allies he could find among the honest folk who'd grown weary over the years of watching Hale swallow up smaller operations one by one. Found a few willing to speak up, Otis reported on the second evening, settling heavily into a kitchen chair while Clara set a plate of stew in front of him. Sam Ridley, over at the feed store, Hale forced him to sell half his land 2 years back, using some trumped-up debt claim that never did sit right with folks. And the Hendersons out past the church, same story near enough. Man's got a pattern once you start looking for it. Would they testify? Clara asked. Might if they saw others willing to go first. Folks round here are proud, but they ain't stupid, and they ain't blind either. Not really. Just scared, most of 'em, same as Ferris was scared. Hale's got a way of making folks feel like fighting him ain't worth the trouble it'll cost. Then we make it worth their trouble. Clara said, something resolute settling into her voice. We show them it's possible to win. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and bright, cruel in its ordinariness, as if the sky hadn't the slightest concern for what was about to unfold beneath it. Clara dressed carefully, choosing her good dress despite the wrinkles that hadn't fully smoothed since her wedding day, and found Ethan waiting for her downstairs dressed in his own best clothes, looking like a man walking toward a hanging rather than a hearing. "You ready?" he asked. "No," Clara admitted, "but I intend to walk in there anyway." Ethan's mouth curved just slightly at that. Good answer. Town Hall was already crowded. By the time they arrived, far more crowded than Clara had expected, for a routine foreclosure hearing word had clearly spread the whole of Red Willow, apparently eager to witness whatever drama was about to unfold. Clara felt the familiar weight of eyes on her as they walked in, the whispers rising around them the same way they had on her very first day, and she squared her shoulders and lifted her chin, refusing to let 6 weeks of hard-won ground slip away from her now. Victor Hale sat near the front, immaculate as always, his expression composed into pleasant, confident lines that made Clara's blood run cold with the sheer arrogance of it. He caught her eye as she entered and offered a small mocking nod, the gesture of a man entirely certain of his own victory. Judge Calloway entered a few minutes later, a stern, silver-haired man whose reputation for fairness Otis had vouched for, and the room quieted as he took his seat at the front, spreading papers before him with brisk efficiency. This hearing concerns the foreclosure petition filed against the property of Ethan Walker. Judge Calloway began, his voice carrying easily across the crowded room. On the grounds of outstanding debt and irregularities in water rights filing, Mr. Hale, as the party bringing this petition on behalf of concerned interests, you may present your case. Hale rose smoothly, buttoning his coat with unhurried confidence, and Clara felt her stomach tighten as he began to speak, his voice pleasant and reasonable, every word calculated to sound like concern rather than conquest. Your Honor, it grieves me deeply to bring this petition, he began, and Clara had to bite back the urge to laugh at the sheer audacity of it. Mr. Walker is a neighbor, and I've long admired his dedication to this land. But the facts unfortunately speak for themselves. County records show his water rights filing lapsed due to a delay in submission, a delay of some 3 weeks past the required deadline. Combined with outstanding debt to First Trust Bank, and given the severity of this year's drought, I fear continued delay only harms Mr. Walker further. It is in the truest sense an act of mercy to resolve this matter now before the debt grows beyond any hope of recovery. A murmur moved through the crowd, and Clara caught sight of several faces nodding along, taken in by the smooth reasonableness of Hale's performance. She glanced at Ethan, whose jaw was clenched so tight she worried he might crack a tooth, and reached over to squeeze his hand once briefly beneath the table. Mr. Walker, Judge Calloway said, turning his attention forward, do you dispute these claims? I do, Your Honor. Ethan rose, his voice steadier than Clara had expected given the tension radiating off him. The filing wasn't late. I filed within the proper deadline, same as I have every year since I took over this ranch from my father. If the county's copy shows a different date, then the county's copy has been tampered with. A louder murmur rose at that, and Hale's composed expression flickered just slightly, just enough for Clara to notice, before smoothing back into pleasant concern. That's a serious accusation, Mr. Walker, Hale said, his voice carrying just the right note of wounded surprise. Tampering with county records is no small matter. I do hope you have proof to back such a claim, rather than simply the word of a man facing the loss of his property. We have proof, Clara said, rising to her feet before Ethan could respond, her heart pounding, but her voice steady. Every eye in the room turned toward her, the whispers rising sharply. That's his wife. What's she doing standing up? Surely she doesn't mean to speak in a courtroom. And Clara felt the old familiar heat of judgment crawling up her neck. She ignored it the way she'd learned to ignore it 100 times before, and looked instead at Judge Calloway. Your Honor, my name is Clara Walker. I'd like to present evidence directly relevant to this proceeding if the court will permit it. Judge Calloway studied her for a long moment, and Clara held her breath, uncertain whether this stern, unfamiliar man would grant a woman standing in a courtroom the same weight he'd give any other witness. "This is unusual," he said finally, "but I've never been a judge who turns away evidence out of hand, whoever brings it. Proceed, Mrs. Walker." Clara felt a rush of fierce gratitude, and beside her she caught Ethan's small, proud nod, urging her forward. "3 days ago," she began, "my husband and I rode to the county seat and reviewed the original water rights filing records myself." She produced the copies she'd carried carefully folded in her bag, walking them forward to Judge Calloway's desk with steady hands, despite the pounding of her heart. "This is the original filing, dated exactly when Mr. Walker has always claimed 3 full weeks earlier than the date recorded on the copy held in Red Willow's county office." Judge Calloway examined the document, his brow furrowing as he read it. "This does appear to differ significantly from the date cited in the petition," he said slowly. "It does, Your Honor, because the copy here in Red Willow was altered." Clara produced the second document, her voice growing stronger with every word. "This is a request ledger from the county recorder's office showing a formal request for an amended copy of Mr. Walker's water rights filing. The request was made under the name of First Trust Bank. That would be entirely proper procedure," Hale interjected smoothly, though something in his voice had tightened. "Banks regularly request updated copies of relevant filings for clients with outstanding debt." "It would be proper," Clara agreed, turning to face him directly for the first time. "Except that the signature on this request ledger doesn't belong to any officer of First Trust Bank." She let the silence stretch just a moment, feeling the whole room lean into it. "It belongs to you, Mr. Hale." The room erupted into startled whispers, and Clara watched with fierce, unshakable satisfaction as Victor Hale's composed mask cracked for the first time since she'd met him. Just a flicker, just a fraction of a second, but enough. Enough for the whole room to see it. "That's a preposterous accusation," Hale said, his voice rising slightly, losing some of its practiced smoothness. "I have never." The county recorder, Mrs. Pruitt, examined this signature herself and confirmed it matches documents you've personally signed in other county filings. Clara continued, refusing to let him regain his footing. "She's prepared to testify to that fact under oath should the court require it. I'd also direct the court's attention to the timing. Your Honor, this amendment request was filed only 2 weeks after Mr. Hale attended our wedding, where he made his interest in acquiring my husband's eastern acreage quite explicit." "Your Honor, this is absurd. I object most strenuously." "Sit down, Mr. Hale." Judge Calloway said, his voice suddenly hard, as flint, all trace of earlier neutrality gone from his expression. "You'll have your chance to respond, but I'll hear the whole of Mrs. Walker's evidence first." Hale sat, his face gone rigid, and Clara felt something powerful surge through her. Not vengeance exactly, but something close to it. The particular satisfaction of watching a bully finally forced to reckon with consequences he'd never imagined he'd face. "There's more," Clara said, and this time when she reached into her bag, her hand found the brass token Otis had recovered from the fire. She held it up for the court to see. 2 nights ago, while my husband and I rode to the county seat, 3 riders attacked our ranch. They set fire to our hayfield, fired shots to spook our cattle, and assaulted our ranch hand, Otis Graham, who has worked this land faithfully for decades. In the chaos, one of the attackers dropped this token stamped with the mark of the Hale Cattle Company. The murmur that rose this time was louder, angrier, and Clara caught sight of several faces in the crowd. She recognized Sam Ridley from the feed store, the Hendersons from past the church, their expressions shifting from curiosity to something sharper, something that looked unmistakably like recognition. "That token could belong to any man who's ever worked for me," Hale said, though his voice had lost most of its earlier confidence. "It proves nothing beyond the fact that I employ a great many ranch hands." "It proves a great deal when combined with everything else," Clara said, turning to face the crowd, now letting her voice carry across the room the way she'd once let it carry across a churchyard, defending herself against Agnes Collier's cruelty. "Mr. Hale would have this court believe my husband is a careless rancher who missed a filing deadline." The truth is, he is a man who has watched Mr. Hale swallow up one small ranch after another for 2 years, using forged documents, manufactured debt, and when persuasion fails, outright violence. I'd like to speak, Your Honor, if I may. The voice came from the back of the crowded hall, and Clara turned along with everyone else to see Sam Ridley rising slowly to his feet. His weathered face set with the particular resolve of a man who'd finally decided fear wasn't worth the cost of his silence any longer. "Mr. Ridley," Judge Calloway said, "you have something relevant to add?" "I do, Your Honor." Sam's voice shook slightly, but he pressed forward anyway. 2 years back, Hale claimed I owed him money on a feed contract I never signed. Said if I didn't pay, he'd take it to the bank, ruin my credit clean through. I paid 'cause I was scared, and 'cause I figured a man like that had more power than a man like me. But I never did see that contract with my own signature on it. Always wondered about that. He looked at Hale directly, something steely settling into his expression. "Starting to wonder a good deal more hearing what Mrs. Walker's laid out today. I have something to add too, Your Honor." Mrs. Henderson stood now, her voice trembling, but determined, her husband's hand steadying on her shoulder. "Same kind of thing happened to us. Debt we never remembered taken on papers, we never signed that Hale swore we did. We sold half our land rather than fight it, 'cause we didn't think anyone would believe us over a man like him." One by one, other voices began to rise from the crowd. Not all of them, not even most of them, but enough, a steady accumulation of small injustices that had been silently endured for years, finally finding the courage to speak now that someone else had proven it was possible to stand up and be believed. Clara watched Victor Hale's face throughout, watched the confident mask crumble further with every voice added to the growing chorus against him. Watched the room that had once laughed at her transform slowly and unmistakably into a room that was watching him. Instead, weighing him, judging him, finding him wanting in a way that made her chest ache with something she hadn't expected to feel. Not triumph exactly, but a kind of vindication so profound it nearly stole her breath. "Your Honor." Hale said, his voice finally cracking under the weight of it. "These are unsubstantiated claims gathered together simply because a woman with a grudge—" "A grudge?" Clara's voice rang out sharp and clear, cutting through his protest without hesitation. "You mocked me in the street the day I arrived in this town, Mr. Hale. You insulted me at my own wedding. You threatened us in open country, and then you burned my husband's field and assaulted a man who's done nothing but work honest land for 30 years. I don't need a grudge to want justice for that. The truth alone is reason enough." Judge Calloway raised his hand for silence, and the room settled slowly into a tense and expectant quiet. "Mr. Hale," the judge said, his voice grave, "I have heard sufficient evidence today to warrant serious concern regarding the legitimacy of this foreclosure petition, and frankly regarding several other matters that have now come to this court's attention. This hearing is postponed. I am ordering a formal investigation into the water rights filing discrepancy, the forged documents brought forward by multiple witnesses today, and the assault upon Mr. Graham. Until that investigation concludes, no foreclosure action against Mr. Walker's property will proceed." The room erupted not into cruel laughter this time, but into something entirely different, a rising swell of voices that carried something like astonishment, something like satisfaction, something Clara hadn't dared hope to hear directed toward her and Ethan on the day they'd walked into this hall. "This isn't over," Hale said, low and venomous, as he rose from his seat, his composed mask entirely abandoned, now revealing something colder and more dangerous underneath. His eyes fixed on Clara with a hatred so raw it made her breath catch despite everything. "You've made a grave mistake today, Mrs. Walker. You have no idea what you've started." "I know exactly what I've started," Clara said, holding his gaze without flinching, feeling Ethan step up close beside her, his presence steady and unwavering. "I've started the end of you getting away with it." Haley's jaw tightened, and for one long tense moment Clara thought he might say something further, might threaten them again in front of the whole town, in front of Judge Calloway himself. Instead, he turned and strode out of the hall, his fine coat swirling behind him, the crowd parting before him in a silence far more damning than any laughter could have been. Clara let out a long, shaking breath once he'd gone, the adrenaline that had carried her through the hearing beginning to drain away all at once, leaving her legs unsteady beneath her. "You did it," Ethan said quietly, turning to look at her, his eyes bright with something Clara had never seen there before. Not gratitude, not surprise, but something that looked unmistakably like awe. "Clara, you just stood up in front of the whole town and took that man apart piece by piece." "We did it," Clara corrected, though her voice was unsteady with exhaustion and lingering fear. "I couldn't have found any of it without you riding beside me every step." Around them the crowd was beginning to disperse, but not without pausing. One by one, faces Clara recognized from her cruelest reception weeks before, stopping to offer words she'd never expected to hear, directed her way. "That was something, Mrs. Walker," an older man said, tipping his hat as he passed. "Never seen anyone stand up to hail like that in all my years in this town." "Proud to know you, ma'am," Sam Ridley added, extending his hand, which Clara shook with a warmth that surprised her. Even Agnes Collier approached hesitant, her expression carrying none of its usual sharpness. "Mrs. Walker," she said, and there was something almost sheepish in it. "I owe you an apology, I expect. Didn't know the half of what you were made of when I said the things I said." Clara studied her for a long moment, feeling the old sting of 6 weeks of cruelty still tender beneath the surface, but finding unexpectedly that she had no interest in prolonging it. "Apology accepted, Mrs. Collier," she said simply. "We've all got room to learn better." Agnes nodded, something like genuine gratitude crossing her face, and moved off into the dispersing crowd. Ethan watched the whole exchange with an expression Clara couldn't quite read. And when they finally stepped outside into the bright afternoon sun, he turned to her with something urgent in his face, like a man who had something he needed to say and had run out of reasons to keep holding it back. "Clara," he said, "I need to tell you something." "What is it?" He hesitated, glancing back toward the town hall, toward the dispersing crowd, toward the whole world that had just watched his wife stand tall against a man who'd terrorized this town for years. "I think I've been wrong," he said slowly, "about a lot of things. Wrong about what a marriage is supposed to look like. Wrong about what makes a woman worth—" He stopped, shook his head, started again. "I told myself that first day this was just an arrangement. Just business. I told myself I didn't have room left in me for anything more than that. Not after Sarah, not with the ranch hanging by a thread." Clara's heart was pounding, though this fear was entirely different from the fear she'd carried into that courtroom. And now I'm standing here watching the whole town look at you like you're something worth admiring, and all I can think is, I already knew that. Knew it the second day you were here fixing my ledger like it was nothing. Knew it stitching up Otis with hands steadier than mine. Knew it in that churchyard standing up to Agnes without so much as a flinch. His voice had gone rough, unsteady, in a way Clara had never heard from him before. "I just didn't have the courage to say it out loud, 'cause saying it meant admitting I wanted something more than an arrangement. Wanted a wife. Wanted you." Clara felt something crack wide open in her chest. 6 weeks of careful walls trembling under the weight of words she hadn't quite let herself hope for. Ethan. But before she could say anything further, before either of them could finish whatever moment had begun to unfold between them in the bright afternoon sun outside a town hall that had for the first time seen her as something other than a joke. The sound of hurried footsteps interrupted them, and Otis came around the corner at a near run, his face pale, his bandaged side clearly forgotten in his haste. "Ethan, Clara." He skidded to a stop in front of them, chest heaving. "You need to come quick. It's the ranch Hales men. They didn't wait for the hearing to end proper. Word just come in they're heading out there right now, and I don't think they mean to just threaten this time." The ride back to the ranch felt longer than any distance Clara had ever traveled, though in truth it was less than an hour. The horses driven past sensible limits, her heart hammering with a fear sharper than anything she'd felt in that courtroom. "How many men?" Ethan shouted over the pounding of hooves, not slowing. 4, maybe 5. Otis called back, riding hard beside them despite his still healing side. "Sheriff's riding out too, but he was 2 streets over when word came, and Hale's men got a head start we can't make up in time. Then we don't wait for the sheriff, Ethan said, and Clara heard something in his voice she hadn't heard before. Not fear, though. Fear was surely somewhere underneath it, but a kind of grim, focused resolve that reminded her of the man who'd stood between her and Agnes Collier in the street on her very first day. They crested the final ridge as the sun hung low and orange over the western mountains, and what Clara saw below made her blood run cold all over again. 5 riders had already reached the ranch yard. 2 were dismounted near the barn torches lit, despite the daylight remaining, and a third had his rifle trained on the house itself, where Clara could just make out movement in the front window, a shape she prayed was simply a curtain caught by wind, and not something worse. "They're going for the house this time," Ethan said, his voice gone flat and hard. "Not just the field." "Ethan, wait." Clara caught his arm before he could spur his horse down the slope. "If we ride in reckless, we're 2 against 5, maybe worse odds if they're armed and ready. We need to think." "Clara, that's my home down there. Could be Sarah Whitfield's ghost sitting in that window for all I care right now. I ain't leaving it to burn while I sit here thinking." "I'm not saying don't go," Clara said. Her mind working fast, the same clarity that had carried her through Judge Calloway's courtroom, settling over her, now like armor. "I'm saying go smart. Otis, can you circle wide, come up from the north pasture? Draw their attention, while Ethan and I come in from the tree line." Otis's weathered face was grim but steady. "Been doing this longer than you 2 been alive combined. Give me 2 minutes head start." He wheeled his horse and vanished into the brush along the ridge, and Clara turned to Ethan, whose jaw was clenched so tight she worried again he might crack a tooth. 2 minutes, she said. "Can you hold that long?" "For you, I can hold a lot longer than that." His eyes found hers fierce and searching. "Clara, whatever happens down there, nothing's happening to either of us today," Clara said, cutting him off before he could finish a sentence that sounded too much like a goodbye. "We didn't survive a courtroom and a county seat and a hayfield fire just to lose everything in our own front yard. 2 minutes, Ethan. Then we move." The 2 minutes stretched agonizingly long, Clara's heart pounding so hard she could feel it in her throat, and then, from the north pasture, a rifle shot cracked through the evening air, followed by Otis's voice bellowing something wordless and furious, and the riders near the barn spun toward the sound, momentarily distracted. "Now," Clara said, and they broke from the tree line at a dead run. What followed happened faster than Clara's mind could fully process, even as she lived through it. Ethan firing a warning shot that sent one rider's horse rearing in panic. Clara's own voice raised loud and commanding as she'd never used it before, shouting for the men to stand down, that the sheriff was already riding, that Judge Calloway himself had ordered an investigation into everything Hale had done. One of the riders, younger than the others, hesitated at that, his rifle wavering. "Judge Calloway knows," he called out, uncertainty cracking through his earlier bravado. "Whole town knows," Clara shouted back, seizing on the crack in his confidence. "Sam Ridley spoke up today. The Hendersons spoke up. Mrs. Pruitt at the county seat has records proving forgery. You burn this ranch tonight, you're not just committing arson, you're adding to a mountain of evidence that's already burying your employer. Is that a mountain you want to be buried under too?" The young rider's face went pale, and Clara watched him glance toward the others, toward the older man, who seemed to be leading them, the same man she realized with a jolt, who had tipped his hat to her mockingly in the darkness 2 nights before. "She's bluffing," the lead rider snarled, though something uncertain had crept into his own voice now. "Hale said the judge wouldn't touch him, said he's got the whole county board in his pocket. Your employer's pocket just got a good deal emptier this afternoon." Ethan called out, his rifle steady, despite the tension radiating off him. "Ask him yourself next time you see him how that hearing went. Ask him how many folks stood up in that courtroom and told the truth about what he's done to 'em." For a long, tense moment, nobody moved, the standoff hanging in the balance, and then the sound of approaching hoofbeats, many of them fast and purposeful, broke the stalemate entirely. Sheriff Daniels came thundering into the yard with 3 deputies behind him, and the lead rider's face went from uncertain to openly panicked in the space of a single breath. "Drop your weapons!" Sheriff Daniels bellowed, his voice carrying easy authority across the yard. "This ranch is under protection of the county pending investigation, and I got half a mind to arrest every one of you for trespass and arson right this minute." The riders exchanged glances, calculation flickering across their faces, and then one by one they lowered their weapons, all except the lead rider, whose hand hovered near his holster a moment too long before Ethan's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Don't," Ethan said, quiet and dangerous. "Whatever Hale's paying you ain't worth what happens next if you go for that gun." The lead rider's jaw worked, fury and fear warring visibly across his features, and then finally his shoulders sagged, and he raised his hands in slow, grudging surrender. "Smart choice," Sheriff Daniels said, dismounting with the easy authority of a man who'd handled worse than this in his time. "All of you off your horses' hands where I can see 'em. We're going to have a nice long talk about who sent you out here and what exactly you were told to do." It took the better part of an hour to see the riders properly restrained and loaded for transport back to town. Otis emerging from the north pasture with a triumphant, if exhausted, grin, his rifle still smoking faintly from the warning shot that had turned the tide. "Told you I still remembered how to shoot," he said, swaying slightly on his feet, and Clara rushed to his side, catching his arm as adrenaline finally began to drain from his body, leaving exhaustion in its wake. "You did beautifully," she said. "Now sit down before that side of yours opens up again and I have to stitch you twice in 1 month." Sheriff Daniels approached, as Otis settled gratefully onto an overturned bucket, his expression grave. "Mrs. Walker, Mr. Walker, I owe you both an apology, truth told. Should have looked closer at Hale's dealings years ago. Man's got a way of making trouble look respectable, dressing it up in fine coats and county board seats." He glanced toward the riders being loaded onto a wagon for the ride back to town. "These fellas are talking already, scared enough of jail time to want to save their own skins. One of 'em's already admitted. Hale ordered the fire 2 nights back, said he wanted to send a message before you two reached the county seat." "Will that be enough?" Ethan asked. "Enough to hold him accountable proper, not just make him pay a fine and walk free. Combined with everything Mrs. Walker laid out in that hearing today, and now attempted arson and assault added on top." Sheriff Daniels' expression hardened. "I reckon Victor Hale's about to discover exactly how far his fine coat and his bank connections can carry him, and I got a strong suspicion it ain't near far enough to escape what's comin'." He tipped his hat and moved off to oversee the departure of the wagon, and Clara found herself standing in the ranch yard, exhaustion crashing over her in a wave now that the danger had finally truly passed, the adrenaline that had carried her through the entire day beginning to ebb away and leave her shaking in its wake. Ethan noticed immediately, closing the distance between them in 2 long strides. "Hey," he said, gentler than she'd ever heard him, his hands coming up to steady her shoulders. "You did it. It's over. Hale's finished, and this ranch is still standing, and you're still standing, and that's all that matters right now." "I'm fine," Clara said, though her voice wavered slightly, betraying the lie. "Just tired. It's been a very long few days." "It has," Ethan agreed. "Longest few days of my whole life, I reckon, and I've lived through some long ones." He studied her face carefully, something tender and searching in his gaze. "You scared me today, Clara Walker. Standing up in that courtroom riding into a standoff without so much as blinking. Never met a woman with courage like yours." "I was terrified the whole time," Clara admitted. "Every single moment of it." "That's what makes it courage," Ethan said quietly. "Ain't brave if you ain't scared first." They stood there a moment in the gathering dusk, the ranch yard finally quiet around them, Otis dozing on his bucket, the last of the sheriff's men riding out with their prisoners. And Clara felt something settle into place inside her chest. Not relief exactly, though relief was certainly part of it, but something deeper. A sense that she had, for the first time in longer than she could remember, truly earned her place somewhere, not through apology or accommodation, but through standing exactly as she was and refusing to be diminished. The days that followed carried a different quality than any that had come before. The fear that had shadowed every conversation, every ride into town, every knock at the door, finally lifted. Word spread through Red Willow faster than any fire could have traveled. Victor Hale had been arrested 2 days after the standoff. The combined weight of forged documents, witness testimony, and the confessions of his own hired men, proving more than even his connections at the bank could shield him from. Judge Calloway's formal investigation, once opened, uncovered a pattern of fraud stretching back nearly 3 years, touching not just Ethan's water rights, but the Ridley's feed contract, the Hendersons' land dispute, and several other quiet injustices that had never before found the courage to speak themselves aloud. Clara rode into town with Ethan the week after the arrest, and the difference in how the streets received her was so stark, it nearly brought tears to her eyes. Not the cruel, mocking whispers of her first day, but genuine greetings, tipped hats. Women who had once sneered, now stopping to ask with what seemed like real warmth how she and Ethan were faring after everything. "Mrs. Walker." Mrs. Henderson called from the porch of the general store, waving her over with an eagerness that would have seemed impossible 6 weeks before. "I've been hoping to catch you. Wanted to thank you proper for what you did. Ted and I got a letter from the county board yesterday. They're reviewing our land dispute now on account of everything that came out in that hearing. First real hope we've had in 2 years. "I'm so glad," Clara said, and meant it fully. Feeling a warmth bloom in her chest that had nothing to do with vindication and everything to do with genuine kinship. "I hope it resolves in your favor. Whether it does or not, we owe you for the tryin'." Mrs. Henderson's eyes were bright with unshed tears. "Man like Hale, he counts on folks feeling too small and scared to fight. You showed this whole town it's possible to stand up. That's worth more than I know how to say." Clara carried that warmth with her through the rest of the errands, through the mercantile where the shopkeeper gave her an extra measure of sugar, on the house for the trouble you've been through the church where Preacher Thomas caught her hand and pressed it warmly between both of his, telling her that her courage in that courtroom had been, in his words, nothing short of a testament to what faith and grit together can accomplish. It was outside the bank, however, that the encounter which would linger longest in Clara's memory occurred. Agnes Collier standing near the entrance, her expression carrying none of its old sharpness, hesitating visibly before approaching. "Mrs. Walker," she said, "I wonder if I might have a word." Clara paused, some old wariness rising despite herself, though it settled quickly when she saw the genuine discomfort on Agnes's face. "Of course. I've been thinking a great deal these past days," Agnes said, her hands twisting together in front of her. "About the things I said to you. About my own foolishness, if I'm honest with myself, which I don't always manage to be." She took a breath. "I judged you the moment you stepped off that stagecoach based on nothing but your size, and I told myself my judgment was somehow a kindness to Ethan, warning him he'd settled for less than he deserved. I see now I had it entirely backward. He didn't settle for anything. He found something most folks in this town, myself included, would have been too blind to recognize even if it stood right in front of us." Clara felt her throat tighten, the old wounds of 6 weeks of cruelty aching even as they began slowly to heal. "Thank you for saying that, Mrs. Collier." "I mean to do better," Agnes said. "Starting with asking if you and Mr. Walker might join us for supper sometime once things settle. My husband's been saying for years I ought to hold my tongue more and my judgment less. Reckon this is as good a time as any to start proving him right." They rode home that evening with the sun setting gold and warm across the pasture, the ranch coming into view, whole and unburned and entirely theirs. And Clara felt for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach something that felt remarkably close to belonging. "You've been quiet," Ethan observed, glancing over at her as the wagon rolled along the familiar road. "I've been thinking," Clara said, "about how different this town looks now than it did 6 weeks ago. Or maybe it's not the town that's different. Maybe it's just that they finally see me clearly, instead of only seeing what they'd already decided about me before I ever opened my mouth." "Same thing happened to me," Ethan said quietly. "Took me longer than it should have seen you clearly. Judged you same as everybody else did that first day, even if I never said the words out loud. Told myself I was being practical, marrying for necessity, stead of feeling, and used that as an excuse not to look too close at who you actually were. And now I don't know how I ever looked at you and saw anything but exactly what was standing in front of me." His eyes found hers steady and unguarded in a way that made her breath catch. Strongest woman I ever met, Clara. Smartest too, and kindest, and I spent the first weeks of our marriage too scared of my own history to admit any of it. Clara felt her heart swell with something she hadn't dared name yet. Some fragile, hopeful thing that had been growing quietly beneath the fear and the fighting and the 6 weeks of proving herself one small act at a time. "Tell me about her," she said softly. "Sarah. I think you need to say it out loud properly if you're ever going to stop carrying her like a wound that won't close." Ethan was quiet for a long moment, his hands loose on the reins, the horses ambling along the familiar road without needing much guidance. "Loved her something fierce once," he said finally. "Thought I'd marry her, grow old with her, raise children on this land same as my father raised me. When she left, I told myself it was 'cause the ranch wasn't good enough, wasn't secure enough, and if I just worked harder, saved more, built something sturdier, it wouldn't happen again." He shook his head slowly. "Took me a long while to understand the truth of it wasn't about the ranch at all. Truth was, Sarah never loved the parts of me that mattered most. Loved the idea of me handsome rancher, respectable family name. But the second that idea got complicated by real trouble, she was gone. Didn't love me enough to stay through hardship. Just loved what I could offer her when things were easy." "That's not love at all," Clara said quietly. "That's just convenience wearing love's clothing. Didn't understand that distinction till you." Ethan's voice had gone rough, unsteady in a way that made Clara's chest ache with tenderness. "You rode into open country with 3 armed men in the darkness over a ranch that wasn't even legally recognized as half yours yet. You stood in a courtroom in front of the whole town and took apart a man everyone else was too afraid to challenge. You did all that, not 'cause it was easy, Clara, but 'cause you'd decided somewhere along the way that I was worth fighting for." He reached over, taking her hand in his grip warm and certain. "That's love. Real love. The kind that shows up even when things get hard, especially when things get hard. I didn't understand what I was missing with Sarah till I watched you prove day after day what it actually looks like." Clara's eyes had filled with tears she didn't bother hiding. 6 weeks of careful walls finally fully coming down. "I've spent my whole life believing I wasn't the kind of woman men fought for," she said, her voice unsteady. "Believing my worth was something to be negotiated, apologized for, hidden away in rooms where nobody would have to look at me too closely. You've never once made me feel that way, Ethan. Not since that very first handshake in the street." "Wouldn't know how to," Ethan said simply. "Not after watching everything you've done these past weeks. Clara Walker. I don't rightly know how to say this pretty 'cause I ain't ever been a man good with pretty words. But I love you. Started somewhere around that ledger, I reckon, though I was too stubborn to admit it till just now. Love you fierce and complete, and I intend to spend whatever years I've got left proving it if you'll let me." Clara felt the words settle into her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds after a long gray winter, and she found herself laughing through her tears, a sound of pure unguarded joy she hadn't allowed herself in longer than she could remember. "I love you too," she said. "I think I have for weeks now, if I'm honest, though. I was too frightened to say it first, given how our arrangement started." Ethan pulled the wagon to a gentle stop in the middle of the road, the horses shifting patiently in their traces, and turned to face her fully, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with a gentleness that made her breath catch. "Never in my whole life did I imagine a mail-order bride would end up being the best thing that ever happened to me," he said softly. "Reckon the good Lord's got a sense of humor sending me exactly what I needed, dressed up as something I thought I only wanted out of necessity." "Reckon he does," Clara agreed, leaning into his touch. Ethan kissed her, then slow and certain, the first real kiss they'd shared since that hurried business-like wedding 6 weeks before, and it carried none of the coldness of that first ceremony. Only warmth and tenderness, and the particular certainty of 2 people who had fought together, bled together in their own ways, and found on the other side of it something neither of them had dared hope to find. They arrived home to find Otis waiting on the porch, a knowing grin spreading across his weathered face at the sight of them. "Well," he said, "took you too long enough. Was starting to think I'd have to lock you both in the barn till you sorted yourselves out proper." Otis, Ethan said, though there was no real reprimand in it, only warm exasperation. Just saying what everyone on this ranch has known for weeks now, Otis said, chuckling as he pushed himself up from his chair. Man falls for his wife's cookin', and her courage both ain't no shame in finally saying so out loud. Clara laughed, the sound easy and genuine, and found herself for the first time since stepping off that stagecoach into a wall of laughter, entirely at peace with exactly where she stood. Not despite the shape of her body. Not because anyone had decided to overlook it, but because the people who mattered most had finally truly seen past it to everything else she carried inside her. The weeks that followed brought their own quiet rhythm of healing. Judge Calloway's investigation, concluding with Victor Hale, formally charged for fraud forgery and orchestrating the assault on Otis, his once formidable cattle empire, seized and divided among the very families he'd wronged, including a fair portion, returned to Sam Ridley and the Hendersons in restitution for years of manufactured debt. Clara found herself in those weeks settling into the ranch not as a temporary arrangement, but as a genuine home. Her hands growing steadier in the garden she'd begun planting behind the house. Her relationship with Otis deepening into something like the family bond she'd never quite found. With her own relations, her evenings with Ethan filled now with easy conversation and quiet affection, rather than the careful distance of strangers learning to coexist. One evening, as autumn began its slow creep across the pasture, cooling the air and gilding the grass gold, Ethan found her on the porch, sitting in the same spot where he'd first confessed to her about Sarah, and settled beside her with something in his hands she couldn't quite make out in the dim light. "Got something for you," he said, a little awkward, a little shy, in a way that made her heart squeeze with tenderness. "For me." He handed her a small wooden box, and inside, nestled in soft cloth, sat a simple gold ring. Not extravagant, not the kind of jewelry a wealthy man like Victor Hale might have offered, but clearly chosen with care, the band engraved with a small delicate pattern that reminded her of the wildflowers that grew along the riverbank. "We got married in a hurry," Ethan said quietly. "Out of necessity, without either of us really choosing each other the way folks ought to choose. Wanted to give you something that meant I'm choosing you now, properly. Not for the bank, not for the ranch, not for anything, but the simple fact that I love you, and I want the whole world to see it plain on your hand." Clara's eyes filled with tears again, the ring catching the last of the evening light as she slipped it onto her finger and found it fit perfectly, as though he'd known her hand as well as he'd come to know her heart. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Not near as beautiful as you," Ethan said, and though the words were simple, unpolished entirely without the practiced charm of a man like Hale, Clara understood them as the truest compliment she'd ever received, because they came from a man who had watched her fight and bleed in her own way, and stand tall against a town that had once laughed at her, and had chosen in the end to love every single part of what he'd witnessed. "I used to believe," Clara said softly, turning the ring on her finger, "that a woman built like me could only ever hope for an arrangement. Something practical. Something that asked nothing of love, because love wasn't meant for women who looked like this." She looked up at him, her heart entirely open now, unguarded, in a way that would have terrified her 6 weeks before. "You taught me that wasn't true, Ethan. Every single day, in 100 small ways. You taught me my worth was never negotiable at all. Weren't me that taught you," Ethan said, pulling her gently closer, tucking her against his side with the easy familiarity of a man who intended to spend the rest of his life doing exactly that. "You already knew it deep down. Just took a fool cowboy fixin' his own broken way of seeing the world to finally recognize what was standing in front of him the whole time." They sat together as darkness settled fully over the ranch. The same porch where a lonely man had once told a stranger their marriage was only business now, holding two people who had built through fire and fraud and courtroom battles and quiet acts of courage. Something far more precious than either of them had dared imagine possible. When that stagecoach first rolled into Red Willow, carrying a woman the whole town had been too blind to see clearly, Otis's voice carried faintly from inside the house, calling something about supper being nearly ready, and Ethan chuckled softly against her hair. "Reckon we ought to go in," he said, though he made no move to rise. "Reckon we ought to." Clara agreed, equally unmoving content, simply to sit a while longer in the quiet peace of a home that had finally truly become her own. Supper that night carried an ease neither Clara nor Ethan had known in all the weeks since her arrival. Otis regaling them with some exaggerated tale about a bull he'd once wrangled. Single-handed a story Clara suspected grew taller with each telling, while Ethan laughed in a way that had become familiar to her, now open and unguarded. Nothing like the careful, closed-off man who'd met her stagecoach with dread in his eyes. It was near the end of the meal, the plates nearly empty, when a knock sounded at the door, sharp and urgent enough that all three of them went still. "Bit late for visitors," Otis muttered, already reaching for the rifle propped near the doorframe out of long habit. Ethan crossed to the door and opened it to find Sheriff Daniels standing on the porch, hat in hand, his expression grave in a way that made Clara's stomach drop straight through the floor. "Evenin', Ethan. Mrs. Walker." The sheriff's eyes moved between them. "Sorry to come callin' so late, but I figured you'd want to hear this from me direct, for word got twisted travelin' through town." "What's happened?" Clara asked, rising from the table, her heart already pounding. "Hale tried to run," Daniels said. "This afternoon while he was still awaitin' formal sentencin'. Bribed one of the deputies watchin' him near made it clean out of the county before we caught wind of it." "Near made it," Ethan repeated slowly. "Meanin' he didn't." "Meanin' he's sittin' in my jail right now, and the deputy who took his bribe is sittin' right alongside him, and Judge Calloway's none too pleased about any of it." Daniels shook his head. "Man tried to buy his way out one last time, same as he's bought his way out of trouble for years. Difference is this time it didn't take." Clara felt a complicated knot of emotions tighten in her chest. Relief, certainly, that Hale hadn't escaped the consequences of everything he'd done, but beneath it something colder. The reminder that a man who had burned their field and sent riders into the darkness to threaten them had come within hours of walking free entirely. "Is it over now?" she asked. "Truly over. Judge Calloway's moved the formal sentencing up to day after tomorrow," Daniels said. "Wants it done quick and public, make certain nobody else in this county gets any ideas about buying their way clear of justice. Figured you two would want to be there, given everything." Ethan glanced at Clara, some silent question passing between them, and Clara nodded steady, despite the fear still coiled in her stomach. "We'll be there," she said. The 2 days that followed carried a strange suspended quality. The ranch quiet autumn settling deeper into the pasture, the ordinary rhythms of chores and cooking and mending continuing even as all three of them privately counted down the hours until Victor Hale would finally fully answer for everything he'd done. Clara found herself on the second night unable to sleep, and came downstairs to find Ethan sitting at the kitchen table in the near dark, a single candle burned low beside him. "Couldn't sleep either," she said, settling into the chair across from him. "Kept thinking about something Daniels said." Ethan's fingers turned a coffee cup slowly on the table, not drinking from it, just needing something to occupy his hands. "Man tried to run rather than face what he'd done. Even now, even caught dead to rights with half the town testifying against him, he still thought he could buy his way past consequences. Some people never learn that consequences aren't for negotiating," Clara said quietly. "They spend their whole lives believing enough money or enough charm can talk their way around anything. Hale's about to discover otherwise. Scares me a little," Ethan admitted, thinking how close he came to it working. If that deputy hadn't got cold feet, if Daniels hadn't caught wind in time, man could have vanished clean, and we'd have spent the rest of our lives wondering if he'd come back someday to finish what he started. "He didn't get away," Clara said, reaching across the table to still his restless hands with her own. "And even if some small part of this fear lingers a while longer, Ethan, we've already proven we know how to fight. Whatever comes, we face it together now. That's not nothing. That's everything, actually." Ethan turned his hand over beneath hers, lacing their fingers together, something steadying passing between them in the quiet dark of the kitchen. "Never thought I'd say this," he said, "but I'm grateful for that drought. Grateful for the bank breathing down my neck. Grateful for every hard thing that led me to write that letter to the agency. Wouldn't have found you otherwise." "Strange thing to be grateful for?" Clara said, though her voice was thick with emotion. Strangest blessings usually come wearing the ugliest disguises, Ethan said. Learned that from you, actually, though I don't reckon you meant to teach it. Chakai. The morning of the sentencing dawned crisp and clear, the whole town once again gathered at town hall. Though the atmosphere carried none of the uncertain tension of the earlier hearing this crowd had already watched. Victor Hale unmasked, already heard the testimony of men and women he'd wronged for years, and their mood now carried something closer to grim satisfaction than curiosity. Clara sat beside Ethan near the front, Otis on his other side, and watched as Victor Hale was led in stripped of his fine coat, dressed instead in plain clothes that made him look smaller, somehow less formidable than the man who'd clapped mockingly at their wedding months before. Judge Calloway took his seat with brisk efficiency, spreading papers before him with the same grave authority he'd carried into the earlier hearing. Victor Hale, he began, you stand before this court having been found through overwhelming testimony and physical evidence guilty of forgery, fraud, incitement to arson, assault, and attempted flight from justice. This court has heard from no fewer than 7 witnesses describing a pattern of deception and intimidation, stretching back some 3 years, targeting hard-working families throughout this county who trusted wrongly that their neighbor operated in good faith. Hale's face remained carefully composed, though Clara noticed the muscle jumping in his jaw, the same tell she'd learned to recognize in Ethan during their most frightened moments. This court sentences you to 8 years imprisonment. Judge Calloway continued, with full restitution ordered to every family whose land, livestock, or livelihood you fraudulently claimed. Your remaining assets, including the Hale Cattle Company and all associated holdings, are to be liquidated and distributed accordingly. Furthermore, given your attempted flight from custody, I am recommending to the county board that you be permanently barred from holding any position of financial trust within this territory for the remainder of your natural life. A murmur of satisfaction moved through the gathered crowd, and Clara felt Ethan's hand tighten around hers, the tension of months finally fully beginning to release from his shoulders. Hale's composed mask cracked at last, something desperate and furious flashing across his face as he was led away in restraints. This isn't justice, he snarled, his eyes finding Clara across the courtroom, with a hatred that made her skin crawl even now. This is a mob deciding they don't like a successful man dressing up their envy as enough, Judge Calloway said sharply, and the deputies moved him along without further ceremony. His protests fading as he was led from the hall, the doors closing behind him with a finality that seemed to settle over the whole room like a held breath finally released. Clara let out a long, shaking exhale, feeling months of accumulated fear finally truly beginning to drain away. It's done, she whispered. It's done, Ethan agreed, pulling her close, uncaring of the crowd around them. Truly and finally done, Clara. He can't touch us anymore. Can't touch anyone in this town anymore. Around them, the gathered townsfolk began to disperse, but not without pausing. Sam Ridley, clasping Ethan's hand with genuine warmth. Mrs. Henderson, embracing Clara with tears in her eyes. Preacher Thomas offering quiet words of gratitude for the courage that had finally brought years of quiet suffering into the light. The months that followed unfolded with a gentleness Clara had never dared imagine possible when she'd first stepped off that stagecoach into a wall of cruel laughter. The ranch prospered in ways that felt almost miraculous after the hard drought years. Autumn rains finally arrived, filling the river. Hale had once tried to steal from them, greening the pasture that had scorched black in the summer, fire the cattle growing fat and healthy on grass that hadn't grown so tall in years, according to Otis's careful reckoning. Restitution from Hale's liquidated holdings arrived in careful installments, enough to clear the last of Ethan's debt to First Trust Bank, entirely enough to repair the barn, properly enough to plant new fencing along the eastern boundary that had once been so contested. Clara found herself in the quiet evenings that followed keeping the ranch's books with genuine joy rather than mere necessity, watching the numbers climb steadily into figures that promised not just survival, but genuine prosperity. The town itself had changed too, in ways both large and small. Agnes Collier made good on her promise of supper, and though the evening carried its own awkwardness at first, by the end of it, Clara found herself laughing genuinely at Agnes's dry humor, discovering beneath the woman's earlier cruelty a person capable of real warmth, once her fear and judgment had been set aside. Sam Ridley's feed store began stocking the herbs and remedies Clara had learned from her mother, after word spread of how she'd saved Otis's life, and more than one ranch family found their way to her door in the months that followed, seeking advice for illness or injury that Doc Reeves was too far to reach in time. "You've built yourself quite a reputation," Ethan observed one evening, watching her carefully measure dried yarrow into small paper packets for a family 2 ranches over whose youngest had come down with fever. "Mrs. Clara Walker Healer of Red Willow. Might need to add doctrine to your list of talents alongside ledger keepin' and courtroom takedowns." "I only do what my mother taught me," Clara said, though she couldn't quite hide her pleased smile. "It feels good, Ethan, being useful, being wanted instead of merely tolerated." "You were never merely tolerated," Ethan said, settling beside her at the table, watching her steady hands work. "Not by me. Not for one single day, even when I was too foolish to say so out loud." Clara looked up at him. Something warm and settled, blooming in her chest. Not the desperate, uncertain hope she'd carried in those first weeks, but something deeper now rooted and sure. "I've been thinking," she said slowly, "about something." "What's that?" "About how this all began. An arrangement, you called it. Practical necessity, nothing more." She set down her measuring spoon, meeting his eyes fully. "I think, given everything that's happened since, we ought to have a real wedding. Not the rushed ceremony we had that first day with half the town laughing, and neither of us having chosen the other freely. Something we choose properly, this time in front of the people who've come to matter to us." Ethan's face broke into a slow, genuine smile, the kind that had become so familiar to her, now nothing like the guarded stranger who'd met her stagecoach. "Already got the ring on your finger," he said. "But if you're wanting a proper ceremony, Clara Walker, I'd be honored beyond words to marry you all over again. Properly this time. With vows, we actually mean said, in front of folks who've earned the right to witness it." They set the date for early spring, when the pasture would be green and full, and the last chill of winter finally broken, and word of the coming ceremony spread through Red Willow with a warmth that would have seemed impossible to Clara during those first cruel weeks. Mrs. Henderson insisted on helping with the flowers. Agnes Collier, in a gesture that still occasionally left Clara faintly astonished, offered to organize the reception supper, recruiting half the women in town to contribute dishes. Even Mr. Ferris, the nervous county clerk, whose small courage had first cracked open the truth about Hale's fraud, sent word that he'd be honored to attend if they'd have him. The morning of the ceremony arrived clear and bright spring sunlight, warm across the ranch yard, where they'd chosen to hold it close to the porch, where so much of their story had unfolded, the confession about Sarah, the ring given in the gathering dusk. The countless quiet conversations that had slowly, steadily built something neither of them had dared hope for in those uncertain early days. Clara dressed carefully, choosing a new dress this time, made specially by a seamstress in town, who had, with genuine skill and evident care, created something that fit her beautifully, rather than merely adequately soft blue fabric that caught the spring light, simple but elegant, nothing like the wrinkled second-best dress she'd worn to that first hurried ceremony. Otis found her in her room, offering his arm with a gruff tenderness that brought tears to her eyes. "Never had children of my own," he said quietly. "Would be honored if you'd let an old ranch hand walk you down, seeing as your own family's a good ways off." "I'd be honored too, Otis," Clara said, taking his arm, feeling the weight of genuine family settle around her in a way she hadn't known since her father passed. The ranch yard was full when they emerged. Not the sparse mocking crowd of that first ceremony, but the whole warmth of Red Willow gathered together, faces Clara had come to know and trust. Over the months, Sam Ridley and the Hendersons' preacher Thomas, beaming near the front. Even Sheriff Daniels standing quietly near the back, his hat held respectfully against his chest. And there, waiting at the front of it all, stood Ethan, dressed in his good clothes. His hat removed his eyes, finding hers the moment she appeared, and holding there, with an expression of such open, unguarded devotion that Clara felt her own eyes fill with tears before she'd even taken her first step toward him. The walk across the ranch yard felt entirely different from that first nervous walk into the church all those months before. Not a march toward uncertain obligation, but a journey toward something she'd chosen fully freely, with a heart no longer guarded against the possibility of genuine love. Preacher Thomas's voice carried warm and clear across the gathered crowd as Clara reached Ethan's side Otis, stepping back with a proud, misty-eyed nod. "We're gathered here today," Thomas began, "not merely to witness a marriage, but to celebrate something this whole town has watched unfold with genuine wonder. These past months, two people who found in circumstances neither of them chose freely something far more precious than either dared hope for. A love built not on convenience or appearance, but on courage and honesty, and the simple, powerful choice to see each other clearly exactly as they are." Ethan reached for Clara's hands, his own trembling slightly, with emotion he no longer bothered to hide. "Clara Whitmore Walker," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quiet yard. "6 months ago, I stood in a church and married a stranger, out of necessity, telling myself it was only business, only survival. I was wrong about near everything that day, except one thing. I was right that you'd change my life, though I never could have imagined how completely." His voice grew rough with emotion. "You taught me that worth ain't measured by what a person looks like, or what folks say behind cupped hands in the street. You taught me real love shows up, especially when things get hard, stands its ground even when standing costs something. I choose you, Clara. Not out of necessity this time, but out of the deepest, surest love I've ever known. I'll spend every day I got left proving I'm worthy of standing beside you." Deal. Clara felt tears streaming freely now, unashamed, surrounded by a town that had once mocked her cruelly, and now watched her with nothing but genuine warmth and admiration. "Ethan Walker," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "I came to Red Willow believing I'd traded one kind of loneliness for another, expecting nothing more than a cold arrangement to survive in. Instead, I found a man brave enough to stand between me and cruelty from the very first day, even when he barely knew my name. I found a home and a family and a love I'd stopped believing was possible for a woman like me." She squeezed his hands tightly. "I choose you too, Ethan. Fully, freely, with a heart that finally believes it's worthy of exactly this kind of love. Whatever comes next, hard years or easy ones, drought or plenty, I intend to face every bit of it standing right beside you." Preacher Thomas smiled warmly at them both. "Then by the power vested in me, and with the joyful witness of this whole community, I pronounce you husband and wife. Ethan, you may kiss your bride." The kiss that followed carried none of the awkward formality of that first ceremony. Warm, certain, celebrated by a crowd that erupted into genuine cheers and applause. Otis whooping loudly enough to startle the horses. Agnes Collier dabbing at her eyes with a lace handkerchief. The whole of Red Willow celebrating a love story that had begun in cruelty and mockery, and had somehow, through courage and honesty and quiet daily acts of proving worth, blossomed into something the whole town now claimed a small piece of pride in having witnessed. Tag. The celebration that followed stretched long into the golden afternoon tables laden with food, contributed by half the women in town, music from a fiddle player Otis had recruited from 2 ranches, over laughter and dancing filling the yard that had once, months before, been the site of a devastating fire meant to drive Clara and Ethan away entirely. Clara found herself in a quiet moment near sunset, standing at the edge of the celebration, watching Ethan dance with old Mrs. Pruitt, who had traveled all the way from the county seat for the occasion, insisting she wouldn't miss it for anything after everything Clara had shown her about courage and justice. "You look happy," Otis said, settling beside her with a plate of pie in hand. "Truly happy, I mean. Not just contentment. Something deeper than that." "I am happy," Clara said softly. "Happier than I ever imagined possible, Otis. There were nights back before I came here when I believed I'd spend my whole life being tolerated at best, never truly wanted. This." She gestured toward the celebration, toward Ethan's laughing face, toward the whole community that had gathered to celebrate a love story built from the unlikeliest of beginnings. This is more than I ever dared hope for. Well, you earned every bit of it, Otis said, patting her hand with genuine affection. Watched you walk into this town facing more cruelty than any person ought to face, and watched you meet every bit of it with more grace and grit than I've seen in a lifetime of livin'. Ethan's a lucky man. Told him so myself more than once. I'm the lucky one, Clara said, watching Ethan catch her eye across the yard, his smile warm and certain a promise of everything still to come. He crossed to her a moment later, pulling her into his arms as the fiddle music shifted into something slower, more tender. Mrs. Walker, he said, may I have this dance? I don't know how to dance properly, Clara admitted, laughing softly. Neither do I, Ethan said. Reckon we'll figure it out together, same as we figured out everything else. They swayed together beneath the gathering dusk, the whole town watching with open affection, and Clara found herself thinking back to that first terrified walk down the stagecoach steps. The cruel laughter that had greeted her, the certainty that she'd traded one kind of pain for another, equally uncertain future. She could never have imagined in that frightened moment that she would end up here, cherished, celebrated, standing in the arms of a man who had learned to see her clearly and had chosen freely and fully to love every part of what he saw. What are you thinking about? Ethan asked softly, noticing her distant expression. About how far we've come, Clara said. From that first day when this town looked at me and saw only my size, only something to mock and dismiss. Now look at us. Ethan pulled her slightly closer, his voice thick with emotion. This town learned something important watching you these past months, Clara. Learned that worth ain't about what a person looks like on the outside. It's about what they're willing to fight for, willing to stand up for, willing to love with their whole heart despite every reason the world's given 'em to guard it instead. He pressed a gentle kiss to her forehead. You taught this whole town that lesson. Taught me that lesson most of all. As darkness settled fully over the ranch, the celebration slowly beginning to wind down, guests departing with warm embraces and promises to visit soon. Clara stood on the porch beside her husband, watching the last of the wagons roll down the road toward town. The same road that Stagecoach had once traveled, carrying a frightened, uncertain woman into a future she could never have predicted. Happy? Ethan asked. His arms settled comfortably around her shoulders. More than happy, Clara said, leaning into him fully, feeling the weight of genuine belonging settle over her like the warmest blanket. I have a home, Ethan. A real one built not on pity or convenience, but on genuine love and genuine respect. I have a family, you and Otis, and now half of Red Willow besides. I have a life I never dared imagine possible back when I was just a girl the world had already decided to mock before it ever bothered to know her. And you'll have more still, Ethan said quietly. This ranch is gonna prosper now, Clara. Gonna build something here together year after year, and someday— He hesitated, something tender and hopeful crossing his face. Someday, if you're willin', I'd like to fill this house with children who'll grow up knowing their mother taught this whole town what real courage looks like. Clara felt her heart swell with a joy so complete it nearly stole her breath entirely. I'd like that very much, she whispered. They stood together on the porch as the last light faded from the sky. Stars beginning their slow emergence overhead, the ranch quiet and peaceful around them. No longer a place of fear and uncertain arrangement, but truly, fully a home built by two people who had learned through fire and fraud and courtroom battles and countless small acts of quiet courage exactly what real love looked like. Somewhere behind them, Otis's voice carried faintly humming some old tune as he began clearing away the last of the celebration's remnants, and the sound of it, ordinary and warm, felt like the truest kind of blessing proof that the family Clara had built here was real and lasting, and entirely hers to keep. Ethan Walker, Clara said softly, turning to face her husband fully in the gathering starlight. Yes, Mrs. Walker. Thank you, she said, for seeing me. Truly seeing me from the very first day, even when I couldn't yet believe it myself. Ethan cupped her face gently in his hands, his eyes shining with a devotion that carried none of the guarded distance of that first terrible day. Thank you, he said, for teaching me how to see clearly at all. He kissed her then beneath the wide Montana sky, in the home they had built together, against every cruel expectation the world had once placed upon them. Both a woman, once mocked for her size, a man once broken by loss and fear. Two people who had found in each other exactly the kind of love that no fraud, no cruelty, and no doubt could ever again shake loose. And as the stars gathered fully overhead, casting their gentle light across a ranch that had weathered fire and fraud and finally found peace, Clara understood with complete and unshakable certainty that she had found not merely a husband, not merely a home, but the truest proof of a lesson she would carry with her for the rest of her days, that a person's worth was never measured by the cruel judgments of a world too quick to look away, but by the courage to stand fully in who they were, and the willingness to love and be loved exactly as they truly are.